Welcome, and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note all audio connections are currently muted, and this conference is being recorded. To ask a question via WebEx audio, please click the Raise Hand icon on your WebEx screen, which is located above the chat panel on the right. This will place you in the question queue. If you are connected to today's meeting via phone audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Sir, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the audience for attending today's MSC meeting. I'm here with Doctors Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey, who are the other members of the MSC. And joining the call from the ISO staff, we have if somebody mute, thank you. We have Danny Johnson, who will be making the first presentation this morning on resource efficiency evaluation. Partha Malvatkar, who will be then presenting on transmission before lunch. We anticipate a lunch break about noon. And then in the afternoon, we'll have the greenhouse gas discussion. Other staff that are with us, besides Partha and Danny, we have Shami Davis, Miloš Bozanak, and Andrew Ulmer. And I think that's everybody for the moment. There'll be other staff who are joining us. So I've mentioned the three major agenda items in the extended day ahead market. And in a few minutes, we'll start off with the resource efficiency evaluation with Danny. But before we do so, as always, I will ask if there are any comments or questions that any members any audience members would like to address to the committee about agenda items other than those that we're already talking about today. So any questions or comments or concerns other than about the three agenda items today. So Michelle, would you invite people to queue up on the phone line if they have any comments or questions?
Yes, once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question in today's meeting, please click the Raise Hand icon above the chat box if you are connected to today's meeting via WebEx audio. If you are connected via regular audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. All right, I do not see that there are currently any questions in queue.
I'm sure the audience will make up for it later. So we can now go to the first major agenda item, and I'd like to welcome Danny Johnson, who's the Market Design Sector Manager in Market Infrastructure Group at the ISO, who will be talking about the EDAM's resource efficiency evaluation. Danny, it's yours.
Danny, do remember to unmute your line.
Yeah, the double mute. Can we go to the next slide? And thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for the introduction. So I wanted to give an overview of what the EDAM RSC is, and I think picking up on some of the comments that Dr. Bushnell raised in the MSC opinion for the WEIM RSC, and then some of the comments that were offered by Board Member Bornstein, I wanted to kind of talk about why we have an EDAM RSC, and hopefully that kind of sets up the discussion. So what it is pretty simple. It's a daily test to determine if each BAA has sufficient supply that would allow it to meet its own obligations on a standalone basis. But the real question is why do we have this? And I think there are a couple reasons that stakeholders coalesced around about why we have it. the high-level version is that it's necessary to account for different RA programs and capacity constructs of participating BAAs. To the extent that this can be done, I think that there's additional confidence in the transfers that would be cleared by the EDAM market. But the reason why it should be done is really that the ISO operates with a different capacity energy market construct, energy-only market. And our market has existing bid caps, and I think what we want to do is ensure that the EDAM can't be utilized as an alternative to sufficient forward contracting under the capacity construct that exists in the West today. One could imagine a situation where, with the more limited bid caps present in the day-ahead market, it could be a benefit or at least an option for BAAs to say, I'd rather not engage in forward capacity contracts and be exposed to these lower capped energy prices in a day-ahead market only. So the idea here is we want to preserve the forward contracting design or construct within the Western interconnection. So I'd like to stop there and see if that kind of helps frame at least what we understood to be the stakeholder sentiment behind having an EDAM RSC.
Yeah, and I guess this is basically the lingo confidence in transfers I had trouble resonating with. But yeah, I think when you kind of consider that the idea here is that you're going to make day-ahead exports have the same priority as internal load for purposes of emergency curtailment and those sorts of things, that's where you sort of get into wanting a little more confidence about what's backing those exports or imports. And so, we have must offer obligations kind of with similar sorts of goals in mind. So I can see the logic here. I think as we will discuss, there's some questions about, how far we go in in allowing sort of compromises to this sort of principle and where the cost benefits are of that.
Yeah, and then I think what you just highlighted right there, Jim, was important, that the real-time MOO kind of helps in the CAISO BAA, but this is in lieu of having a day-ahead or a real-time MOO for all of the different EDAM BAAs since there's no common RA program. And I think that this then gets to that second bullet, which if you do this, it ensures there's also liquidity to clear the market itself. So one benefit is it reduces market power concerns. Second is that it would limit the likelihood of having to set administrative prices. While a BAA could bid in all of their resources really high, like that, the general idea is there should be at least enough bids to clear the market without having to default to administrative pricing and artificial scarcity.
Well, just the fact that there's going to be joint load shedding if there isn't enough capacity. So we need to make sure, that at least ex ante, everybody brings a fair share of capacity to the table, because we're going to, in real time, there's going to be a joint evaluation, right? For all the EDAM members. So,
right, but we're also retaining the real-time RSC, but it is going to be linked now to these day-ahead schedules. So
it's going to be linked, and I think we'll get to this in a few slides, but the idea is that day-ahead schedules for all of the EDAM participants would feed into the WEIM RSC and be tested as a whole.
Right. So all the BAAs in the EDAM are going to sink or swim together. So they all have a common interest in making sure that they all bring a fair share of resources that are going to perform.
Yeah, and then this kind of gets back to one of the things Dr. Bushnell mentioned is what type of compromises are we interested in? And I think that's a fair point. There are some kind of compromises in the stringency of these tests, but it is made, those compromises are being made, and I think would be agreed to by all the participating BAAs, because ultimately it's their load that is at risk if we get those compromises wrong. So. Are there any other questions on this slide, or?
Danny, yeah, we do have somebody in the phone lines, Kathleen.
Okay, sure.
Michelle, could you unmute Kathleen?
Yes, she did. Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I wanted to say, Danny, I appreciate you framing the reason for the RSC in the EDAM this way. And I want to share that Vistra has the same view of why we need a robust RSC. And I think that is the way that you described it, is we don't want the RSC to be harming these forward capacity construct, the forward capacity construct that we have and that are being set up in other parts of the West through, let's say, RAP. And there are other constructs, but I'll just use those two as examples. We've been pretty open about concerns with the RSC design, very specific ones we try to put in our comments. And the reason that we have these concerns is because we believe that this is the reason that we need an RSC. And certain design elements, such as the obligation trading that's being proposed, we think harms that construct. Pooling of BAAs that pass in the real time harms that construct. I'll just use those two as an example. But so I think it's comforting that we share the same view. The elements that we oppose of your proposal are because they don't further and they harm that in our perspective. So I just want to provide extra context for Vistra's opposition to the RSC as it's proposed is really because it hurts that goal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later and look forward to that. Let's see, Scott or Jim, should we ask Danny to continue?
Yep.
It's me.
Right.
Okay. Michelle, can we go to the next slide? So this is getting more into the how the RSC will be implemented. We do envision this as part of our kind of sequential day-ahead market process where we run, I think the plan now would be an RSC, a GHG pass, a NPM pass, an IFM, and it's going to be slotted in at the start of that process. So it'll be run prior to actually clearing the IFM, but again, sequentially in that process. It will utilize the resource bids made available by each BAA. I think this is an important thing to note. Like, we're trying to use a common bid set across all of the different market runs within our day ahead process. It will also use the ISO's market optimization and all of its existing resource models. This will allow us to account for energy or use limited resources optimally across the entire 24-hour period. It will evaluate this bid and supply against the demand forecast plus an uncertainty requirement that we are calculating. That is being determined and finalized in the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. The demand forecast that'll be used, the ISO will plan to offer a BAA level demand forecast, but we would accept happily demand forecasts from BAAs if they want to self-provide it. The idea would be we just want to use the most accurate forecast possible. Again, the uncertainty requirement would be calculated by the market operator, in this case, the CAISO. It would be using the standardized methodology that's put forward as part of the DAME proposal. AS, at least on go live, would be self-provisioned. I think there's a long-term goal for co-optimized AS, but that is not something that we would look for as part of the initial EDAM offering. BAAs will simply say, this is my AS requirement. These are the bids, or these are the segments of resources that I'd plan to utilize to meet this AS requirement, and then that would be validated. And the validation would just make sure that that supply wasn't also being counted for passing the EDAM RSC.
Yeah, just a quick, I don't want to digress too much, but I was just curious about, we had a discussion last week about the use of ancillary services in energy a little bit, and it sort of evolved that pretty much anybody who bids ancillary services in CAISO these days is contingency only. And I was just curious if that's more or less the practice outside of CAISO as well, that that these AS units are basically treated as off limits except during contingencies, or whether they are sort of used for balancing as well for less, specific contingency purposes. I assume that's up to the BAA as to how they want to use them. And depending on different practices, I've just been trying to process, how we should or should not credit that.
Yeah, I would probably need to kind of defer to some of the audience members about their practices. I would suspect they're slightly different because the reserve sharing groups that are used for AS are more prevalent across the rest of the Western Interconnection than in the CAISO, but I think that other folks on this call can probably give you a more accurate answer than I can.
Okay, it's not really central, so yeah, I don't want to chew up time, but if people do have a sense, you can email me or whatever. And I guess we'll come back to this, but I was also wondering if this interacts with, for example, in the real-time RSC now we have this ABC kind of carve-out credit. Is ancillary services capacity, is that part of that ABC? Is there a similar sort of credit working here?
Yeah, I don't think there'd be a credit here. I think in the real time, our thought is the ABC is more reflective of reg, although it could be contingency-based AS, I guess. But
Yeah.
In the EDM, there's no we have other mechanisms, we think, that we'll talk about to kind of withhold capacity that a BAA might want to for whatever reason. That's a little bit different than the real-time ABC construct.
Okay.
Again, to follow up on that, 'cause
Yeah.
we were a little, we were talking about this and a little bit unsure. For if someone wants to have an export constraint, is the capacity that's held back held out of the RSC? Or can you offer capacity to pass the RSC and then not make it available to the market?
You can offer capacity to the RSC and not make it available to the market, but there's a limit that you couldn't withhold more. Like, you basically can't limit it by more than the capacity that you needed to pass the RSC. So if you have an 8 megawatt requirement and you show 10 megawatts of supply, your net export constraint would let you withhold 2 megawatts of extra supply. Your 8 at least has to be available to meet your own load. And then, I guess this is kind of jumping ahead, but one of the benefits of that in our eyes is it allows the BAA to make all of their supply available, and then the market can determine what's the optimal use of that supply given whatever kind of reliability-based capacity they want to preserve going into the real time.
Yeah, I think we should bore into this when we get to this export constraint, because we're wondering about diversity benefits and whether this could somehow work contrary to or limit the diversity benefits, because it's so focused on internal serving rather than the sort of external contributions that capacity is providing. But let's.
Okay.
I'm trying to process what you said, Danny, because if it's in addition to their RSC requirement, why would it be needed to clear their load? And if it were clear, and we wouldn't want it to clear,
You're asking why would anybody want to keep off the market capacity that's in
what
excess?
is the implication? I mean, if you're saying I'm going to offer it in the RSC in excess of my RSC requirement, but I'm going to not let it be exported. So, it can't clear. It seems like it could only be cleared against your load and your imbalance requirements, right? And that would necessarily be excess because your RSC should be sufficient to cover that. And I suppose, and is it resource specific withholding or is it just an aggregate?
It's an aggregate. And I think what might be getting mixed up here is the RSC is just using the bid stack made available to the IFM. And the reasons why a BA might want to withhold that are a couple. The initial offering doesn't have a replacement reserve product, so a BA might want to hold back supply for kind of intraday replacement reserves if they need it.
Well, what's the point of
also,
offering it in the IFM and the RSC if it can't be cleared? I'm trying to figure out why would you bother even doing it, because it's in excess of what you need to pass and it can't be cleared. So
Well,
If you know exactly what the most efficient, in my example, 8 megawatts of supply to meet your 8 megawatt of load obligation, then you wouldn't need to. But if you have a bunch of storage and VERS and energy use limited resources, you could offer all 10 megawatts and withhold and the 8 megawatts that you need on one bound to pass your RSE would be the most efficient subset of that 10 megawatts, and then you would still have your residual capacity if you needed it.
Okay. So it just to allow you to optimize across your resources. I get it.
Yeah.
and my understanding is some of this is coming from concerns from CAISO stakeholders where, there is a must offer obligation. So you don't really have the option of keeping that off. And there's concerns that, you're exporting RA capacity, even though the day ahead market may say that it's okay, that there's maybe some concern that in real time you'll still need it. It's not clear who would decide that and at what point, but I guess that tool is there.
Yeah. So I would offer that I think that we plan on a follow-up initiative next year for the CAISO BAA to work out how it would participate in the EDAM. And this is one of the exact questions that would be part of that discussion. I think that it would be at the BAA's discretion to implement this constraint, but given the CAISO BAA's diverse membership subset, we would want input from stakeholders on how and when it would be used. And then the other interesting thing, Jim, that I've thought through is you're right that this could be used to kind of ensure RA capacity is available in real time, but I don't know if that necessarily applies just to the ISO BAA anymore. With the RAP getting stood up out there, I think that this constraint may be utilized by RAP participants to make sure that they would be able to meet their RAP obligations as well.
Scott, you're muted.
Another question. You said the demand forecast would be used in the RSE, but in the IFM, you'd be losing bid-in load, right?
Yes.
And some kind of demand resources can be bid into the RSE if they're dispatchable, but I understand it sounds like also emergency demand response can be used to reduce your load forecast in the RSE. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so the RSE forecast is essentially the same forecast that would be used in RUC. The IFM will still be bid and load. So to your point, if there are non-market-based DR that is used to reduce the forecast in the RSE, that would be also mirrored in the RUC process. But IFM would still do whatever IFM does with bid and supply. I think we would look to have some type of validation that a BAA isn't self-scheduling more load into the IFM than their kind of modified forecast, but beyond that, IFM would still clear against bid and load.
So, but you said they can't self-schedule more, but could they just bid in more than their use load at $1,000 at the cap?
Yeah, I think at that point then if the market can clear it, then the market's going to clear it because there's people voluntarily offering in capacity to kind of make up for that, but we wouldn't want to have it self-scheduled at the higher priority, which could, I guess, cause more scarcity when trying to clear the IFM.
Okay. And if RUC doesn't clear, would they have what obligation would they have to perform under the DR if RUC didn't clear? If the IFM cleared and they cleared their load, but because of other things clearing, RUC didn't clear?
I think that the expectation is that if a BAA kind of is modifying their RSE forecast and a RUC forecast, that they would be utilizing the DR in real time. And that's something that we're pretty explicit that we'd plan to, at least at the initial stage, monitor and make sure is occurring. I think trying to have rules around forcing that is harder, so we want to make sure it's a problem first before we try to solve that problem.
But the expectation is that people will act if it's cleared in used in RSE and cleared in RUC. The expectation is they'll activate it in real time.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Danny, I had a couple of questions. So ancillary services will be self-provisioned. So However, in the actual market run, the CAISO ancillary services, of course, will be co-optimized, but it would be the only balancing authority for which that would be true, right?
Yes.
And in the RSE run, would there also be the co-optimization of CAISO's ancillary services, or would those be pre-designated somehow to simplify things?
I think that it would be co-optimized so that for the CAISO BA specifically, the AS obligation would get included on that BA specific optimization.
Okay, all right. And then the other question I just had about the most accurate forecast, this is, these are details I'm sure you'll be addressing later, but is there any thought about who and how would decide what the most accurate forecast is, whether it's the BAAs or the ISOs, or that's to be determined later, how what the process would be?
I think it would kind of fall into the same type of regular quarterly monitoring that we do for a lot of our WEIM data submissions. I know we have a couple, like the MPPF forum and a couple other, I think there's an EIM specific one as well, where these issues are kind of regularly discussed and broadcast about what are best practices or what are things that the market operator is observing with data submission. So I think it would feed into an EDAM variation of that.
Okay.
As of now, it's basically there isn't any requirement for a unified forecasting method. It's just going to be individual BAs transmit their forecast.
Yeah, I unless they wanted the ISO using our methodology to provide the forecast for them as a service.
Okay. Thanks for addressing those two questions. We do have somebody on the phone line. Michelle, could you invite Kathleen to open her line?
Absolutely. Kathleen, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So we had a couple things that we noted that we didn't find particularly clear in your write-up. So I was hoping to ask some of those clarifying questions, if that's okay. And I think I've got like 4, but the first one is transmission. I know that there's just different opinions about internal transmission being modeled. We supported the idea that internal transmission be modeled. I think there are other, but I don't want to belabor that one because that's clear. What wasn't clear to me, Danny, is that the CAISO is proposing for resources that are external to a BAA, that they be able to be supported by a sufficiently firm transmission. But when there is a transmission outage, and that's registered in master file, but when there's outages and the transmission capability is reduced relative to whatever that is registered, it's not, I'm not clear what your proposal is for how you would address a reduction of transmission into that BAA. Can you explain that?
I think I'd ask first a clarifying question. Are you referring to an outage that derated the boundary intertie transmission or internal transmission?
Boundary, please.
I think that I don't think we were explicit, but I wouldn't expect a BAA to be trying to double schedule their transmission that they know that there's an outage on. So if some type of validation is needed to make sure that the RSE self-schedules that represent those firm energy contracts aren't in excess of the transmission capability, I think that type of validation is possible.
Well, and
is that kind of what you're getting at, Kathleen?
Yeah, I think it's a more credible concern because of third-party offers as well. That in a BAA, especially say California, that has multiple load serving entities, I think it's a pretty credible concern. I would assume your proposal is to kind of treat it as a pro rata reduction, maybe on all, or cap the amount of supply that could count in the RSE to that transmission capacity. I've just been struggling with why it's so hard to answer that because that seems pretty logical, right? So if you have 5,000 megawatts of supply, I'm just making up numbers, but let's say 5,000 megawatts of supply being offered at the border, and there's some outage that's reduced that to 2,000, it would just be great for it to be clear that the RSE would limit that supply to 2,000. Like, my question has been very simple.
Yeah, no, I think you raised a really simple question that would be a validation we can implement on the front end of the optimization.
That would be awesome. That'd be awesome. My second question that's been not clear to me is that the write-up says that you are going to minimize cost and minimize shortfalls. So with these two competing objective functions, can you explain, are you really minimizing cost? Are they really two objective functions? Like, and how does the trade-off impact the result?
I think the objective function would be to minimize cost, and the highest cost comes when you have to relax the PVC. So if you can minimize cost, you would in turn kind of minimize the shortfall across the 24-hour period. Where this gets a little bit different is that could lead to potentially a lot of failed intervals by small amounts rather than trying to aggregate the failure into a single interval. But
Yep.
It would minimize cost, and I think I kind of stated how we would expect the results to play out.
Yeah, we can come back to this when we talk about the penalty, because it does seem like there's a mismatch between the objective function and the actual consequences. So
Yeah, that would be great to hear your thoughts on it. The write-up, Danny, in the paper implies that you're minimizing the shortfall irrespective of the cost, and you think that's minimizing cost because it's minimizing the penalties. And if you actually meant it the opposite, as you're minimizing the cost of the PVC, you might want to just go back and tighten up that concept. Because that's a concern of ours, that you're actually minimizing the shortfall and not minimizing cost, and that we're stepping really far away from these cost objectives in the RSE, whereas that is the objective in the IFM. And so that disconnect, we think, will lead to adverse outcomes. But if that's not what you're proposing, clarity on that would be helpful.
So is it correct to say, sorry, Kathleen, I just wanted to drill down on this. So my impression was this would be minimizing cost for a BAA if the penalty for failure were $1,000 a megawatt hour per megawatt hour of failure.
That's how I read their proposal.
Is that a reasonable Danny, does that sound right to you, or?
I'm getting a little turned around on what the concern is. It's
we haven't gotten to a concern yet. Okay. I'm just trying to understand kind of what the actual.
In the scheduling pass, Jim, remember the penalties would be higher than $1,000.
Yeah. Okay. So, but this is are you using the scheduling run PBC violation value then here?
In the IFM, we would be, right?
For
IFM, we would be.
Mm-hmm.
And the RSC, I think I'd actually turn to George. I'm not sure offhand what the planned implementation is. If we just use the pricing run values or the scheduling run values. George, are you there?
Yes, good morning. I was on mute. So the way you describe it, Danny, is accurate. We have the same objective function like in IFM in the RSC. So the RSC problem is really an identical problem with the IFM, with the only exception that there is no network. So it's a single iteration SCEC solution, where you have the same objective function. You're using the bids, and you minimize your solution to meet the demand forecast and the uncertainty requirements. So there are no load bids, no virtual bids, and no transmission constraints or network. Now, you do have the same surplus and shortfall variables that may relax your requirements and your power balance constraint, and these are penalized. These are like penalty variables. So obviously, that solution will try to find we'll try to find a feasible solution at any cost without any shortfall or surplus. And if that is not possible, you may have a shortfall or a surplus in any given hour, and this is penalized. So that's why the application will try to find a feasible solution that you essentially pass the RSC at any cost, because the cost is not relevant for this particular run. We just want to see if you have enough supply available to meet all the requirements. And if it's not, the violations will be minimized and will be reported. And for these hours that you have a requirement violation, that's where you have not pass condition for the RSC, and you will know exactly by how much you're not passing. Make sense?
Yeah, I think the implications are, I'm not sure what this is what the others are, but when you think about storage resources or other sort of shiftable resources, there comes a question about whether the goal should be to minimize the absolute megawatt hours of RSC shortfall, or whether you should minimize the number of intervals of, megawatt hour shortfall, or, given that the penalties sort of have this free band of, for small shortfalls, you could imagine that those shouldn't necessarily be priced at the scarcity level. There's just sort of this, there is a mismatch between what this objective function assigns. And I think there are implications when you start having storage resources or other things that could be assigned intertemporally that may, I don't know how big a concern it would be, but it definitely seems like it's not minimizing the penalties an RSC might be, or a BAA might be exposed to. Maybe we don't want to minimize those penalties, but it does seem a little different.
Yeah,
I think this is a really good point. So imagine there are two alternative solutions. Each would have some amount of expected unserved energy, identical amount of unserved energy, and one solution would put it all in one interval, 1 hour, and the other solution would split it between 2 hours. The IFM type algorithm would be indifferent because they would have the same cost. It would penalize it at $1,000 apiece, dollars per megawatt hour. But would we, for the purposes of the RSE, would we prefer one of those solutions versus the other? Should we worry about that?
So this is something that we have considered. It's a potential variation of the objective function. You could minimize the number of hours that you have a violation, or the megawatt, and we opted to go with the standard way of minimizing the megawatt, which will basically bring the RSC problem very close to, as I said, being essentially the same problem like you solve in IFM. So from a technology standpoint, it's good that we're reusing the same algorithm. The other consideration was that this is a more robust formulation, minimizing the megawatts, because of the reason that you mentioned. If you minimize the hours of violation, you have a not so robust problem to solve, because you have multiple solutions that could result in the same outcome, and we tend to not like this kind of flat optimum solution. So we think the formulation of the IFM of minimizing the overall cost, including megawatt violations, is a more robust problem.
You also would need binary variables if you're trying to minimize number of hours. You'd need a binary variable in each hour to indicate whether or not it's violated in that hour, and that makes things more complicated too, and is not a feature of the IFM. So I think you're right about the algorithm.
Sorry, Danny, I think we cut you off.
Oh, no, the other thing that I wanted to mention that kind of factored into this decision is, what is the RSC testing for? It's kind of testing for is there enough supply in the market in each hour to to meet the demand. So it made sense to us to align the objective function to what's actually occurring in the IFM as well, rather than kind of optimizing ex post penalty.
Yeah, I mean, if the goal of the RSE is to minimize sort of west-wide the overall megawatt hours of shortfall, regardless of when they happen, then this is sort of matching that objective, even if the penalties don't.
Well, I actually think it is going to be an indeterminate solution, because when you're minimizing, the objective function is going to be the same value, whether you violate it 20 megawatts in 2 hours or 40 megawatts in 1 hour. And the vendor is going to do something to
Break the
resolve
tie.
that. But there is an indeterminacy. And what you're going to get is something else resolving which hours it falls in, which might make people crazy. I mean, and the vendors do have rules they use to resolve these indeterminacies, but they may, you might want to find out about that to understand what the consequences will be.
So the rule, if you're just giving the problem to the solver, it gives back a solution. It'll give one solution, one of the alternative optima, but the vendors don't look at alternative optima and say, oh, we want that one versus this one, do they?
Actually, they do. I've done some work with vendors on that, and particularly with work with the NISO, and we got into choosing a better, they have things in there that will result in a solution, but we, got in there thinking about what's a better way to determine the best solution. And, we've talked to, PJM apparently has the same logic in some of theirs. Everybody somewhere in there, the vendors have got some rule to, choose a solution, so they don't give you, oh, well, there's 250,000 solutions, that wouldn't work. But it might be something you want to think about, how, as you get the platform, how you want to resolve those indeterminacies.
What's the time frame on the scarcity pricing enhancements? Are we thinking those will be after EDAM, or because it also seems like if we step up our PBC values, then that's going to sort of feed back into this as well.
I think that with the current implementation, that would probably go live after EDAM.
But yeah, just thinking about the RSE violations, sort of have a built-in principle that a small violation shouldn't be as big a deal as a big violation. Yeah. And I think the idea behind the scarcity pricing would be some version of the same thing. And so in a sense, yeah, once we had that in there, this could be another way of reflecting it, but.
Right. And that would tend then to spread the outages across.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Especially in an IFM, you would think it'd be better to have a bunch of small violations than one super big shortfall.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that reflects the economic reality. Kathleen, you've certainly stimulated a vigorous discussion here. Do you want to say anything else about this?
No, I just want to say thank you. There's been a lot of back and forth. You heard Danny and George talk about it. I think the way it was described versus the formulation was just not incredibly clear to me that where they have landed. And so I really appreciate you guys having this discussion.
Okay.
I had one more clarifying question. And this is a super easy one, Danny. For a resource internal to a BAA that, let's say, has offered to another BAA, so it plans to export, can you just confirm that it is removed from the RSE supply?
I think that's a little more nuanced. It depends if it's exporting to another EDAM BAA or external to the footprint. I think if it's another EDAM BAA, we would look for it to be kind of a bucket one transfer that's reflected in both BAA's EDAM RSE obligations. If it's purely an export out of the market footprint, I think that the best way to do that would actually probably be to self-schedule the export in the IFM, and then that would reflect as additional demand, which that supply could then count towards meeting.
I agree. I'm not sure how to do that for areas that don't have an intertie. You have thoughts?
Yeah, and I would turn to some of the transmission folks, but my understanding is there's not full intertype bidding at other different BAA boundaries, but the ability to reflect and export out of their BAA into the broader West and not EDAM would exist if it's a self-schedule.
It'd be helpful to confirm that. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay,
Milos,
thank you, Kathleen.
I mean, can we like turn to Milos or Partha just to confirm that on that export intertype bidding? Because I think that's what it is, but I want to not leave out any half-answered questions.
This is Milos. That's right.
Okay. Thanks, Milos.
Okay, we can continue, I think.
Okay. Can we go on to the next slide, Michelle? So the application as we've currently proposed it is going to be on demand. So this ideally will allow BAAs to kind of iteratively test their bid sets prior to when we close the day ahead market to make sure that they're able to pass the RSE. We do plan for a couple preset advisory runs, one at 6 a.m. and one at 9 a.m. These will be when we plan to run the application that generates the IRU and IRD requirements for each BAA. So while there are advisory runs, I think those would use the most recently generated forecasts and the most recent bid sets, but they would use the most recent imbalance reserve requirement per either 6 a.m. or 9 a.m. We would look to freeze the inputs at 9 a.m. to allow each BAA to cure against kind of a stable target so we don't have a constantly moving target. Something that Kathleen already alluded to, we are not planning to consider transmission constraints in the EDAM RSE internal to the BAA. I know this was a topic that had a lot of discussion in the stakeholder process. There was a number of parties who thought this was a reasonable position. There was a number of parties who thought we really should be including internal transmission. That's what gets you your real firm deliverability check essentially as part of the EDAM RSE. Where we landed is that initially we're not going to model internal transmission. And the reason is we wouldn't be able to offer this as an on-demand application if we did. We'd essentially be running the market every time that somebody wanted to run the EDAM RSE, which isn't something we think we can support. So I know something that you've previously offered, Jim, of a good way to monitor this would be to look at the RUC results to see what's getting shown in the EDAM RSE, and then if you have infeasibilities in RUC, what's not getting a schedule might be a good way to try to target if there's supply that's being offered into the EDAM RSE that gets stranded when you consider network transmission. And I think going forward, if there's a need to adjust this, we'd be open to that. But at least right now, the stakeholder sentiment was to have an on-demand application without the network transmission.
I don't want to claim credit for that idea. It sounds like a Scott idea, but or maybe I've just forgotten.
No, that was a you idea.
Okay, well, I think I asked you this already, but I've forgotten the answer. So when are bids final? So final bids would be due at 9 a.m. for.
I think that final bids would be due at 10. That's when they're due right now, I believe.
Okay. All right.
The demand and IRU would be frozen at 9.
Okay, but generation bids would still trickle in until you're,
We actually close the market, yeah.
Right. And so the thinking is here that the advisory is just sort of a service, and if they don't want to submit their bids, then their own advisory is going to be garbage, and that's their problem, sort of thing.
Yep.
I do wonder if. I mean, I do wonder, yeah, what kind of spillovers there might be. Like if one BAA fails because some other people are late getting their bids in. And of course, within CAISO, there's sort of, I don't know when the MOO sort of binds and how that might work as well. But
yeah, that's a fair point. I think a lot of participating EDAM BAAs will have a lot of legwork on their end about how they coordinate the bid submission for all their composite parties. Just like the CAISO is going to have that stakeholder process next year to figure out how the CAISO is going to participate, I think that EDA and BAAs will need to have similar discussions within their own control areas.
There will be a BAA by BAA test. So no
Yes.
BAA would fail because of what another BAA failed to do, but it would just be a matter of the resources within the BAA they'd have to get in.
Yeah. The other thing that I'd note while we're on this, this triggered a discussion we had in the stakeholder process is if you start having an EDAM RSC that's not on a BAA by BAA basis that has kind of networked transmission, then your generation starts to impact your neighbor, and then if your generation isn't deliverable, is that your problem? Is that your neighbor's problem? It gets a lot more complicated trying to figure out what passing and failing means and who's not passing and failing based on how they're scheduling. So this avoids having to take on that discussion at this time.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to this when we talk about what kinds of resources count. Because yeah, I think this is related to sort of what types of import contracts you can claim for your RSC. And I've just been wondering about the timing of bids. But if this is all advisory, I don't know how much advisories matter, like how much, yeah, how much action people are going to take on advisories.
I think it's going to be a pretty heavy technology lift to get this stood up. So
yeah.
Our hope is that there will be significant interest in the advisory nature.
Yeah, well then the concern becomes like if the advisories are just sort of not very representative of the final, are people taking really kind of ultimately inefficient actions because they got sort of a misleading answer out of the advisory? But I guess that'll be easy enough to check once we're cranking these out. So
my initial take on that would be the forecast changes between like 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. day ahead shouldn't be that significant, right? Like you're still you're a day out or a day plus 4 hours out. So it should be hopefully fairly useful and informative.
Yeah, I'm thinking more in terms of just resource bids, supply bids, and like whether you can sort of force some instabilities if you get them in at 9:15 or something like that. But
okay.
I don't have a concrete example as to why that's a problem. It just seems odd to be running advisories before you really know all the supply.
Well, remember, it's RSC by RSC, so BAA by BAA, so each BAA could put in all of its supply. So
yeah, but this is where some import contracts count as well, and I don't know exactly.
But that would be determined by the BAA, not by the optimization. Remember, this is capacity. This isn't like clearing in the market. So I think that's the thing here. It's just a BAA putting in its resources, whether they be import or whatever. So I think the only issue is what Danny was talking about, that there might be multiple entities within the BAA, and they've got to all put their stuff in order for the test to be meaningful. But I think it's independent across the BAAs. There's nothing being cleared between BAAs because it's their resource, aside from the WSPP Schedule C virtual supply.
Yeah,
it's all real resources.
Yeah, well, that's going to be an issue we'll get to. Yeah, okay, fine. When we talk about the resources, I want to come back to this though, because I was trying to understand whether if I'm a BAA and I'm claiming a certain amount of import contracts, whether there's any kind of reconciliation of that with the supply availability where those contracts are supposed to be coming from. So it's kind of an added up consistency kind of thing happening. And if you're not doing that check, then I guess it doesn't matter. You're going to do the check at 10 o'clock, I assume, but. Or
the check happens when you're on the markets and then you look at what those market results are compared to what happens in the real time. But yeah, we have a slide dedicated to this because we share your concern about the challenges this could present if not handled correctly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's defer this till we get to that slide.
Okay, Michelle, can we go to the next slide? All right, so now this is talking about the different supply types. So the objective here is to account for all the different types of supplies that are used by EDAM BAAs and try to be as inclusive and resource type and technology agnostic as possible. Again, the default is bids will have to be present for the most part for supply to count. One of the other premises is that the supply should be under forward contract. So this does, for like CAISO's intertype bidding, it would count the CAISO intertype bids that are under a forward supply contract, not just economy energy intertype bids for the purposes of passing the RSC. The second bullet talks about non-resource specific supply. I think the most prevalent variation of this is the WSPP Schedule C contracts. These are your firm energy contracts that you may not know a specific resource or a specific transmission path in the time frame that we're running the EDAM market on. This does present a challenge because we are trying to run a day-ahead market. So we're trying to balance counting these and how we would model these with what we understand has been a long-standing contracting practice that has not had a lot of problems in the Western Interconnection for the last 15 or 20 years. Like they're fairly prevalent from talking with stakeholders. Next, we have emergency or non-market-based demand response. This is something we alluded to earlier when chatting with Scott. These can be used as a load modifier. We would reflect that in the RUC forecast. We also would plan to monitor in the real time to make sure those deployments were occurring roughly in alignment with what was claimed in the day ahead. We don't want the EDAM to be able to be utilized just as purely as a mechanism to avoid emergency type DR if you're planning on using emergency type DR to participate in the first place. And then for VER forecast, for VERs, we would look to use the forecasted amount in the EDAM RSC and the RUC. Ultimately, whether a BA wants to bid in, they're up to their full VER forecast in the IFM, that's their choice. But for purposes of trying to test what capacity we think will be available in the next day using the forecast to us made the most sense. Any questions, or is it, there's a lot of information here that's kind of condensed to a single slide.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of issues to talk through. Before we get to the WSPPC, I'm just thinking about other types of import arrangements. And so the general idea here is that like an RA import would be allowed to count if it's bid or self-scheduled. Is that correct? Yeah. And that's the sort of thing we want to allow, but no other imports would be except these contracts.
Yeah, I think the implementation would be, I think we'd plan to almost enhance our cyber application and allow the SC submitting the bids to kind of check a box and reflect that these bids are under a forward contract, which would then allow them to feed into the RSC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so it would be a forward contract and not just an RA contract in the case of, say, CAISO?
An RA contract as well, yeah.
Yeah. And there isn't currently an idea to sort of check that the amount of contracts flowing out of one BAA is that like if there's a bunch of contracts that are shown to come from A to B, that there's enough supply in A to support that level of contract exports. I'm not sure if I'm articulating that right, but sort of like if there's a 10,000 megawatts of exports from Oregon to California and there's only 4,000 megawatts of resources kind of seemingly available, is there any kind of feedback mechanism there?
At this time, there's no validation plan. I think your feedback mechanism would come when you actually try to clear the IFM because you'd see not enough supply in Oregon and that reflected in the prices. And I think that's what we plan to monitor, but at least on Go Live, we'd assume that the contracts are being offered for RSC purposes and counted for RSC are under contract or RA and otherwise are not kind of fictitious on paper supply.
And And when you say such as WSPPCC, I could imagine sort of coming up with a new kind of contract that's sort of, you know, basically designed to just pass the RSE, but doesn't have sort of firm energy implications if the market does cause problems later. And so when you say contracts such as, like what falls under that? Are there
I think we're,
criterions associated with those contracts that would, you know?
I would probably need to ask some of the internal CAISO BA parties we've talked to, but what's been made clear to us is the majority of these fall under WSPP Schedule Cs, but there are different kind of slight permeations of these contracts that we'd also want to try to account for. We don't spell out in the proposal what those are. We just want to make sure we're not excluding forward contracts.
Right, but I guess there's forward contracts and then there's forward contracts. I guess so the idea here is that these are forward contracts for firm energy, basically, right?
Yes.
With, you know, whatever liquidated damages associated with them. And yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so whether that's articulated explicitly someplace or not, I guess is somebody else's argument. But I'm trying to understand sort of the characteristics behind this clause. And at a minimum, it's sort of that it's unspecified firm energy, and so somebody's paying a big penalty if it's not actually delivered.
That's my understanding as well.
Although, if let's say there's just congestion that prevents delivery. What happens under that sort of circumstance? Is that a liquidated damages circumstance as well, or?
Well, in the RSC, we're not looking at internal transmission. So if it was internal congestion, it wouldn't get picked up.
Anyways,
there's congestion across the intertie. I think when we're planning to model these non-resource specific supply, to the extent that you can actually model this coming from the BAA, that's good. But if it's just a self-scheduled injection at that scheduling point, we would model that against the capacity of that scheduling point. So it would be included in the optimization.
Yeah. I guess I'm just trying to work backwards from, okay, we think there's a set of contracts that we think are as good or almost as good as an actual resource where we know where it is. And then what types of contract characteristics sort of give us that or make us feel more comfortable about that sort of thing. And yes, one of the big issues is because we don't know where it is, we don't quite know what its, you know, implications are for the transmission flows. And as you say, we kind of don't do that with any resources right now. So, but I think there are also even intertie transfer kind of questions associated with, I guess these would be specified at a specific intertie transfer. And then the issue is, can it even get to that transfer? And I guess I'm just curious, I don't know sort of what, if somebody signs a contract like that for delivery at a specific transfer point and they're unable to get it there, does that basically mean liquidated damages are triggered, or are there certain types of just market dispatch things that happen that might absolve them of delivery?
Well, I think that right now our understanding is that these contracts have liquidated damages, and then the general sentiment is if somebody tells you they're going to give you a firm energy contract and they don't show up, you're probably not doing business with that party again. That's burning a big bridge, and so that we would think would continue into the EDAM, and then there's a tagging requirement for these types of contracts also. So there are EDAM effects if they're not tagged as well, which kind of makes the BAA want them to be even firmer and I guess more choosy on who they're partnering with to facilitate these contracts.
Mm-hmm. And the tagging happens after IFM, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I guess one other thought process here is the extent to which these contracts are backed by purchases out of CAISO's IFM. And whether that constitutes a sort of circular logic to the RSE test at that point.
Yeah, that would be a potential double. So basically somebody is scheduling out of the CAISO to meet their or a third-party merchant scheduling out of the CAISO BAA to meet their RSC. I think that's possible. It would, I mean, if the
It's a
market can
risk. Yeah.
clear it, yep, it is.
But you could basically just sell, a contract, and you don't have to tell where it's coming from until sometime after IFM. And so you could plan on basically meeting that obligation with a purchase out of, and I don't know if there's a similar sort of story you could tell from any other BAA as well, but the CAISO, for example, you just buy it out of IFM and then you're sort of using it. Then it could have been, that export could have been used to pass CAISO's IFM, but it's also being used to pass the place that's getting the import from.
I think it's a global concern, and it could happen in any EDM BAA. But and this is something that we have seen to some extent in the EIN as well with HAP schedules.
No, that's why this all seems familiar. And do we have any sense of what percentage of supply would be kind of met by this? I'm not sure it matters because sometimes the last 5% is the important one, but
I think the max I've heard is up to 25% of the BAA's supply position could be these types of contracts, but it's typically smaller.
Yeah, and so this is where, when I was talking about compromises, this was the big compromise I was thinking about. And so, I mean, again, it's sort of a collective decision about how rigorous you want to be here. But there are definitely stories you could tell where this is sort of basically saying, actually, you can use a purchase out of IFM to meet your obligations. Where the whole idea of the RSE was that you were supposed to not rely on the IFM to meet your obligations. And so if you can always write a contract that's sort of backed by an IFM purchase implicitly, then I'm not sure, what we're actually accomplishing.
I think that this might be a little bit of a tired answer by the end of the day, but I think there is a concern there that you're pointing out, and we plan to monitor it. And if it's a problem, like we have had thoughts of like you could start to limit year over year the share of a BA's capacity position out of these contracts to try to force an evolution away from these types of supply contracts if this is a problem. But we want to kind of see if entities are misusing this prior to implementing solutions like that.
Yeah, I think it would be great to sort of be able to have vision on how this market evolves post RSE, IFM, EDAM, because I think there's probably a sense that these are great contracts. They're pretty reliable, and in some ways more reliable than a RA resource that has lower penalties associated with it. So I can see that argument, but whenever a specific kind of arrangement gets linked to a new market rule with specific penalties, then the incentives for trading contracts change, and it would be interesting to see how this market does, or if this market does change. Unfortunately, it's not a very transparent market, right? So we won't know.
The other thing that I'd note that I think kind of helps to mitigate this partially would be that net export constraint, because on a real tight day, if a BA is trying to buy economy energy out of the IFM to meet their forward contracts, they're doing so at the risk that BAA is going to retain their internal supply for their own reliability purposes, and it won't be able to support the export. So that, I think, somewhat
well, I guess
disincentivizes this practice in tight conditions.
Right. I mean, I guess this comes back to sort of thinking about the consequences of failure. And so, I mean, this won't help you actually meet an actual shortfall because ultimately you're going to need the energy. But it might help you at least avoid RSE failure when a shortfall is coming, and maybe that's better than nothing. Both for, the financial consequences and any kind of dispatch consequences that might be involved.
Yeah, this is Scott. I'd like to pick up on something Jim mentioned, because I think it's really important about when you change what the contract's used for. I mean, under the current WSCC, the BAA has an interest in signing contracts with people that are going to deliver, because the consequences of non-deliver is the BAA has to shed load. But if the new consequence is you pass the RSE, and if the person doesn't deliver, fine, you're in a shared risk pool with everybody else. The incentives are very different. I expect great business for the Scott Harvey Trading Company, which will always default and will never pay the liquidated damages, but our business practice will be you pass the RSE. And so it really becomes, what are the consequences of signing a contract with the Scott Harvey Trading Company that fall on the BAA? Because that's what's changed, I think.
Well, I think that this design kind of slightly takes away those consequences, but the shed load consequence is still there. Like the market will not shed any BAA's load, right? But it will isolate the PBC relaxation when you get to the real-time market in the BAA that doesn't have supply. So that load or that risk, I think, is still there.
Yeah, well, that's
for the BAA.
Pretty important. But I mean, the principle I thought was that once you pass the RSE, then there's joint load shedding. I didn't understand that comment actually about the real-time market would isolate the power balance and feasibility in the BAA that caused the shortfall. I mean, that's pretty important, but what does that mean? Does that mean if your generation tripped off, you're the one that sheds the load, or if you're the one that signed with Scott Harvey that we're gonna carry out a real-time RSE, and how is that based on your export schedules and everything?
So when the IFM runs, like it could also not clear, and there could be a BAA who's not whole. But assuming the IFM schedules and everything clears, those feed in as fixed schedules into the IFM or into the real-time market. So then you're asking, where does the PBC relaxation occur, or how does that?
Which BAA gets relaxed if there's not enough resources? I mean, because we've got exports and imports scheduled in the EDAM. So how do we allocate the failure to a specific BAA? If a BAA gets scheduled for exports and then a unit trips off, do they have to shed load?
I think it would be pro rata at that point with honoring their exports export commitments they made in the IFM. Like if they shed they trip off 100 megawatt resource and they have 1,000 megawatts of load and they have 100 megawatts of export, so they have 900 megawatts load and 100 megawatts of export, they would shed 90 megawatts of load and curtail 10 megawatts of EDM export. If through kind of system operators working with each other, there's no other supply out there, and there's no other way to resolve the issue.
Well, there is going to be a BAA by BAA test applied in real time about whether
not in the context of the RSC, but when you actually are clearing the market, the way that the real-time market's set up is that it won't let any EIM exports occur if there are PBC relaxations in that BAA. So it will claw back all of that BAA's capacity to try to avoid a PBC. But if ultimately they don't have capacity because their resource trips off intraday and they don't have a replacement reserve, that's where the shortfall would show up in the real-time market.
Right, but first we'd use all the imbalance reserves to cushion it.
Yep.
So that if you could sign with the Scott Harvey Trading Company and just count on there being enough imbalance reserves in the rest of the EDAM to compensate for the fact that Scott Harvey never delivers.
Yeah, and so this is where I was getting back to with the such as contracts, because what if I wrote a liquidated damages contract where I offered a really good deal on liquidated damages, I guess from the buyer perspective, so it's a $50 liquidated damages instead of a $10,000 liquidated damages. I think there needs to be some policing of that sort of thing. Because you can structure a contract that's just designed to pass the RSC, basically.
Yeah, I think this is something that we can police and review. Like if there is a lot of fictitious supply being used to pass the EDM RSC, that's something we would monitor for and take action on if it turns out to be true.
And
But remember, you're only going to see that it's untrue on the bad days, because most of the time they'll be able to cover it. So it's a thing that'll go on and everything will look fine. The Scott Harvey Trading Company delivers on all the days where the price is $20, but on the days where we have a problem, it's not there. So, but yeah, we have to look for it. That's one solution. And just to clarify something you said before, all of these Schedule Cs would be offered in the day ahead market as price taking schedules at an intertie they selected, right? The
Yes.
BAA would decide what intertie the virtual supply is coming in at.
BAA gets to decide the delivery point on their border. Yes.
is that, oh, sorry, I thought the contracts themselves would have specified an intertie for delivery, but they're not. They're basically generally kind of, we're going to deliver to a balancing area, and the details even of which intertie they'll flow over are usually kind of left to real time.
Our understanding is that the interties are typically specified in the contracts.
Okay,
and
so hopefully the
I think
balancing authority is using that as the delivery point
Yeah.
then, but
and we would have rules such that if the delivery point switches between day ahead and real time, that doesn't become a profitable switching for the BAA.
But just to flesh out Scott's example again, then I was just trying to think through this. So let's say I have a bunch of, low, somehow, cancelable WSPC with low liquidated damages. And I can show them to sort of pass the RSC, but I am really short. But then I also buy a whole bunch of imports in IFM because I passed the RSC. And now those imports have as much priority as the BA who sold them, as the load in the BA who sold them. Now, I guess that BA would not be selling exports into shortfall in the day ahead market, at least. But when you get to real time, there would be, I think there's this shared sort of obligation based on, the imports coming in to the BA who should have failed but didn't, basically having this high priority of import load. Although, you have to sort of, again, I mean, the export BA has these tools to sort of prevent that from happening, from being a big problem.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that the contracts, people can contract for whatever you want, and our expectation is that firm energy contracts that have similar in vein to the WSPPs right now that has sizable liquidated damages and are regularly delivered on is what would be shown for the RSC. So to the extent that there's creative contracting going forward, I think that's definitely a possibility, but we would monitor for it and take action if it becomes an issue. But again, to your point, it would be really hard to tell when it's an issue until you actually get into tight supply conditions.
Yeah. And I mean, there's two, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, I think there's two perspectives here. There's sort of like a day ahead EDAM is really important, and this is a potential loophole to really focus on. Or a day ahead EDAM is not that important, and purchases out of IFM should be considered reliable, and in which case this is basically a way to use purchases out of IFM to show your your RSC, and in which case, what are we doing?
Well, but these have to be self-scheduled, right? So they'd always clear an IFM. Is that right, Danny?
They should. They don't all have to be I think CAISO intertie bids under RA contracts could continue their existing practice, but for BAs that don't have intertie bidding, they would all have to be self-scheduled.
Okay, so they couldn't really rely on imports from somebody else that cleared in the IFM, because these things would always clear if they're self-scheduled. So they'd be financially exposed to buying the power.
Oh, yeah.
At the cap, but if it didn't perform, but it'd only be at the cap. So that's better than buying $1,000 for a few hours is better than paying for a gas turbine. Okay.
But yeah, I agree with the points both of you are raising. This is the big quandary of this is the compromise that stakeholders think is workable right now, because I think a lot of the parties who are interested in going forward with EDAM are doing so in good faith, but to the extent that this devolves into creative contracting, we would definitely look to police that.
Yeah, and I think I can be persuaded that these compromises make sense. Just like the LPT issue with the real-time RSE, which is kind of double counting at times, you can make a case that makes sense. I just think that we need to be, clear about the purity of the RSE's ability, that when we use the language of reliability, there's definitely some compromises underneath it, that sometimes the rhetoric seems to, miss.
Yeah.
We have a couple people on the phone lines who want to step into the conversation. Kathleen Colbert and Sybil Geiselman. Can we take Kathleen first? She's first in queue.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I wanted to add a third perspective to what Jim, you were laying out, kind of different views on it. So the way that we think about it is we need a strong day ahead RSE so that the forward capacity constructs, whether it's a California RA program or the RAP or another, if one happens to come up, are not undercut or diminished by the ability for BAAs or loads within them, really is a better way to think about it, to defer some of their purchases to the equivalent of economy energy purchases that they can gain through EDAM participation. So you need the strong day ahead RSE to mitigate any incentives to do so. You also, we believe, need a strong real-time RSE that is performed on a BA by BA basis. So I know you were talking about a couple different solutions to this problem. We believe the solution, one that was not adopted in whatever negotiated compromise occurred, Vistra's request has been to not pull the BAAs in real time. We think that there are going to be flaws, there are going to be some errors in the day ahead RSE that will mask resource efficiency shortfalls within a BAA. Those shortfalls will be carried into the lean, where they will heighten energy shortfall risk in real time in moments of grid crisis. Unlike, I think, the way you were talking about it, we don't think that is acceptable to carry that risk through to real time. We think it's both risky and naive to allow a BAA to bypass its obligation to balance gen and load in real time. You also need a strong real-time test that has to be performed on a BAA by BAA basis because of all of these potential, inaccuracies in the day ahead. You can't allow them to bypass that in real time and increase the risk of shortfalls. We should be trying to mitigate it. So the third view is strong day ahead so that we don't undermine RA, and a strong real time so we don't increase risk to reliability. Thanks.
Kathleen, can I just follow? I'm trying to understand. It seems like there's undermine RA. There's how an RSE could undermine RA, or like the.
Yeah.
And then there's the. I always thought of it as an RSE might incentivize RA or the equivalent of RA in areas that don't have a formal RA requirement. Whereas I hadn't really thought of it in terms of, if you have an RA requirement, then you have an RA requirement, and I assume those under the requirement have to meet those conditions, whether we have a resource, an RSE or not. And so what's an example of how a weak RSE or no RSE could undermine an RA program? Or is it the incentive to even participate in RAP, for example, that you're worried about?
I think, well, that is an interesting one, but I can give you a much more tangible example.
Mm-hmm.
So the planning reserve margins that make up an RA requirement, right? And within our planning reserve margins, we have our long-term forecast or year ahead, depending on the time frame. But let's say the demand forecast plus the margin. What makes up the margin? Kind of depends on how you determine it. Let's assume we use a loss of load expectation study, though, right?
Mhm.
Let's assume we use LOLE to get to what is the generation fleet needed to meet a minimum reliability standard. And inside that, we model uncertainties. So you identify what the risks are. Stochastic variables are often used for generation availability, especially for, let's say, wind and solar, and reflects the uncertainty around their availability in the RA requirement. We can model lots of different kinds of risk scenarios inside an LOLE. That could include, risks of intertie lines going out. So there's some robust planning tools that can be used to establish an RA requirement. If we believe that an RA framework should still be requiring enough RA to meet to be procured, enough RA resources to meet those needs in advance in a forward showing basis, there is what we would consider a very adverse outcome of an EDAM market is that the planning processes would look at the EDAM and say that by the ability to, let's say, do hourly obligation trading and buy some really excess supply from another BAA through that part of this proposal competes with what is an RA resource, right? So you now have to have very complicated conversation in the forward planning space on whether or not it's appropriate to rely on those types of purchases to meet a portion of your obligation. In California, we have started going down the path of, okay, are we comfortable relying on energy only to meet our RA needs? And I believe that may be okay in the short term as we're trying to build back up into being resource sufficient. In the near term and midterm, it's not a great long-term end state.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying, and I guess I would paraphrase it as it's the RSE is there as a check against weak RA designs. That you could design, you could design RA to be very sort of lots of generous assumptions and that sort of thing, and or, I mean, I guess you could just explicitly say, hey, we're gonna rely on purchases out of IFM for 5% of our needs, which would kind of be the equivalent of just not participating in an RA program. And at least an RSE requirement in theory would prevent folks having that RA approach. Well, yeah, I guess we can debate that, but yeah, I think I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I think of it as more of less of not having an RA and more likely that your reserve margin would not allow you to meet a 1 in 10 with your resources because you're willing to enter into a riskier framework.
Right. I mean, there's dozens of ways you could sort of throw a generous assumption in an RA requirement that would kind of make it look more lenient than maybe what the RSC is, although we're not sure just how strict or lenient the RSC is also. But I think I understand what you're getting at.
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious that we're 3/4 of the way through the time for this agenda item and halfway through the slides. I'd like to take Sybil's question or comment. She's on the line.
Hi, this is Sybil Gieselman from Public Generating Pool. Thanks for this discussion today. Danny, one thing that was missing here on the slide to me was the discussion of the intertie bids for CAISO. And I thought that was a really meaningful thought exercise that you guys were going through around the reliability of these non-source specific supply contracts. And I just wondered if you could review how this applies for the intertie bids and go through a little bit of a similar thought exercise with those. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Sybil. So the intertype bids for the CAISO would count if they're under a forward contract. The intertype bids not under a forward contract wouldn't count for RSC purposes, but we would look to utilize those to clear the market like we do today for the CAISO BAA.
And so if I call up somebody at 5:30 a.m. and say, hey, you want to call this a forward contract today? And they go, sure. Does that count as a forward contract? I guess it's self-identified. We're checking the box. Yeah. So daily purchases are forward contracts, and
which is that I think this kind of just continues the existing framework in the rest of the West. Like BAAs rely on daily purchases to meet their next day obligations right now, and I think we look to extend that into the EDAM. It shifts the timeline a little bit. We'd like that to occur a little earlier before the EDAM, but it's still the same. You can do this stuff day ahead.
Yeah, that's why I wonder, getting back to the previous discussion, just how, if you can sign a contract 72 hours or 48 hours ahead, how much that really supports RA planning. Anyways, but it's the risk that you can't find a counterparty for this that would basically force you into it. But that's kind of what, the risk of blacking your customers out because you couldn't find a counterparty is probably an even bigger motivation to sign a forward contract, I would assume.
Yeah, the same risks that are present today, I think we would view as being present under EDAM, and that's because people now today. What? They're not.
Under today, the BAA has to shed load. Under EDAM, there's going to be a lot of sharing.
It would be a pro rata sharing on what your exports are. Yes, so you're right. It's not totally the same, but there's a lot of the same elements of risk as today. But you're right, Scott. I misspoke.
And I think it goes back to this issue of what is the sanction in real time, and that's kind of what Kathleen was talking about. Yeah. It isn't just the day ahead RSC that's important. This real time hammer is very important to make sure that the real time hammer gets the people to do business with the Scott Harvey Trading Company.
Yeah, so maybe the solution here is to sort of live with a lot of compromises in the day ahead, but where it's not necessarily a reliability thing, but you kind of stick with a more strict set of requirements and sanctions in the real time, because that's where the reliability is really manifest.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about that later. Like, we have kind of a pooled approach, and I know Kathleen's advocating for testing each BA individually, but the downside there is then there's no diversity benefit that you gained in the EDAM. You just procured less imbalance reserves for yourself in the real-time market. So there is a direct, we considered that, but there's a direct trade-off. There are advantages, I guess, to a BAA-specific test, but that just simply requires more day-ahead IRU procurement, which is less diversity benefit, which is less kind of net benefit of EDAM participation. So.
Yep. All right. Well, Ben's been trying to push us on. So.
Yeah. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, Michelle? Okay. So now this is kind of talking about how we would look to model the non-resource specific supply contracts. If the source, we would ask that the source of the supply contract be identified prior to running the EDAM market. If that source is within the EDAM footprint, the sync BAA and/or the third-party merchant will work with the source BAA to model these as a bucket one transfer. We think that to the extent this can be done, it should really result in more accurate price formation in the day-ahead market by utilizing the resources that are actually modeled in the day-ahead market. Ultimately, if the agreement can't be reached to model these as transfers, the ability to model these as a self-scheduled injection at the BAA boundary remains. This has potential double counting issues. This is potential price formation issues, since it's simply introducing a lot of additional price-taking supply into the day-ahead market. So I think we would look to monitor this, and if this starts to produce problems, would limit the amount of WSPPs that may be able to be shown and used in this manner, or at least could be self-scheduled. It's a lot easier of a problem if the source BAA is external to the EDAM footprint. It just gets modeled as a self-scheduled injection at that BAA sinks boundary. This isn't problematic since we're not clearing the supply in the non-EDAM footprint.
We have Doug on the line.
Thanks, Ben. This is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I think this is probably the best place for me to raise our concern about the potential for transmission market power to be exercised. And, you know, our concern is that for today, the, you know, transmission that, well, I should say, parties who have capacity available to be sold have a strong confidence that they'll be able to either forward procure transmission from transmission rights holders, or it will be released in real time as non-firm if it doesn't get scheduled by the rights holder. And that's because of the OAT rules that require that transmission to be released. And what we're concerned about is that for transmission that's now in EDAM, there'll be less incentive for the parties who have the transmission rights to sell that transmission to third parties. You know, they're going to get greater compensation than they get today because they'll get transfer revenues, and our expectation is the congestion is going to be lower than it is today. So our thinking is that this potentially could be addressed by allowing the transmission that gets transmission that's released as bucket 2, pathway 2, or the pathway 3 transmission, or the non-firm transmission that is procured in real time. Any one of those types of transmission, if that can be used to tag the RSE resources. But I'm not certain that there's a mechanism to do that. You know, today, if someone has a WSPP contract, they go out and procure the transmission, and then they can do the tagging. But I think we're going to miss that step under EDAM because, you know, transfers will happen, but how is that tag going to get associated back to the RSE resource?
Danny, you want to try that?
Yeah, no, so I think this is an interesting question. Doug, you kind of raised it in your comments to the draft final proposal. Initial takes, the transmission that's made kind of available to the market for use that's not otherwise sold, maybe allowing that to be used for tagging purposes, and then the OAT rates that would have been procured under could go to offset the transmission revenue requirement might be one potential solution. But I've not really delved into this, so I think I'd kind of defer to, I think Milos has given this more thought than, or has applied more thought to this problem than I have.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. I'll give it a shot, and then, you know, we'd certainly be interested in MSC's perspectives as well. But I think on the first point that Doug made regarding the potential impact on resales, I think it's important to note that the EDAM is not in any way precluding you know, the OAT rights of entities to continue to resell their transmission to entities across different time horizons. Just as today, it continues to be a business decision. Yes, the transmission customer has the ability to, once we get to the transmission discussion, the transmission customer has the ability to potentially release that transmission in the day-ahead time frame from transmission to the EDAM to optimize transfers in return for being eligible for transfer revenue to the extent that it accrues. It's not necessarily a given that at every given hour transfer revenue would accrue, but it's another consideration for those transmission customers that have that ability as they're bilaterally contracting or as they're bilaterally making some of these resale arrangements. It's another element for them to consider. Just like today, it's a business decision based on how they anticipate using those rights that they can bilaterally consider a resale. So the EDAM doesn't necessarily preclude that. We do recognize it adds another choice, but we don't think that this is that as a result of that, now it should change some of the requirements that we've imposed regarding the transmission supporting resource sufficiency evaluation. It's something that the parties bilaterally can arrange and consider. On the other aspect of transmission availability, I can remember if you noted it, Doug, about does this reduce non-firm transmission availability? And I think it's important to note that different types of transmission, the transmission provider offers different types of transmission products on a firm and a non-firm basis. To the extent that, as you noted, that if the transmission is not scheduled, becomes available as non-firm, I think maybe that's what you were referring to, that it increases the availability of non-firm transmission. I think there is potentially an impact there. I think we've acknowledged it, that to the extent that that transmission is made available to the EDAM, it may have less that's released as non-firm for sale to the extent that the EDAM utilizes it. But I think that's a risk that's present today to the extent that all transmission customers, or a majority of them, schedule their firm rights. It impacts the availability of hourly non-firm transmission that's released. But I think we're open to continuing to monitor what are the impacts of the design of the different pathways and potentially to evolve that design as necessary. But we think that there's still an opportunity for parties to continue to transact for firm transmission and short-term firm transmission under the parties' oaths, because each one of the EDAM entities will continue to sell that transmission under their oath frameworks. Those remain in place today. And so I don't know if that answered it. But
yeah, I'm just wondering, Milos, if I could just respond though on the risk of parties using their rights. I think the parties will be more likely to use them under EDAM because today, if they use their rights, and that means they cleared the ISO markets, and then the ISO is counting those resources. Whereas in EDAM, if those aren't forward contracted, ISO is not going to be able to count those intertie transactions. That's from the non-EDAM entities. From the EDAM entities, I think parties are going to release the transmission, and which is great. We want to see that, but that released transmission, if there's no way to give credit, towards the use of that transmission for meeting the RSE, for delivery of RSE resources or WSPP transactions, then we're going to have a hard time passing the RSE during the stress periods, even though there's plenty of transmission to support the transfers.
Just let me understand that, Doug, because if it's released and used in EDAM, then it's used. So someone's using it. And if they release it, but it's not used, it's not cleared in the IFM, then is it not available for purchase?
No, yeah, if they release it and it doesn't clear the IFM, then the proposal is that transmission can still be sold by the transmission provider.
Okay, so you'd still be able to buy it from them. And to make sure I understand the buckets, if the transmission company releases it and it's cleared and used in EDAM and it's congested, they get some of the transfer revenues, right?
That's right.
Now, suppose they sell it to you and you use it and it's congested. Do you get the transfer revenues if you buy it?
Yes.
Okay, so it seems like that's symmetric, that you get the same value they get if they hold on to it. So, aside from the market power issue, which is different. So if there's no market power and we're just talking about the incentives to buy and sell, I don't see where there's
Yeah,
any
it's
problem.
not a problem if there's not market power
Okay, so then the
in
market
the
power
transmission
issue is,
market.
maybe that's an issue of, are there particular interfaces where there's a great deal of concentration of the ownership of the firm transmission, and we need special rules to address the market power?
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand how much of this is an RSE issue versus a transmission issue, because I actually read your comments as sort of falling under the general transmission release kind of sets of design topics. And so it sounds like though you're worried about this kind of, yeah, that obviously that this is going to interfere with your ability to pass the RSC, and so I'm can someone, maybe Danny, explain to me what kinds of transmission needs to be acquired and shown for passing the RSC specifically? Because that's where I'm
There's no,
missing
there's
this.
no transmission at the time that you are running the RSC. There's a tagging requirement after you run the market, 3 hours after the market results publish. And then if the tags haven't been submitted on supply that was shown to pass the RSC or interchange, economy energy interchange by the stuck horizon in real time, then that BAA could be exposed to being kicked out of the pooled EIM RSC.
So that's why this is an RSE issue. It's the firm tagging requirement, or for WSPP, I guess it doesn't have to be firm. But I think what's going to happen is there's going to be less transmission released, to be sold by the transmission provider, because rights holders will say, well, I expect to get good transfer revenue, which is great. Get that transfer revenue. That transmission will be used to support transfers. But I don't see a mechanism for an entity who had an RSE capacity resource in an EDAM area, or had a WSPP Schedule C contract that needed to get access to transmission to the border. They won't get that, right? It'll get used by the EDAM market as bucket 2, pathway 2, for example. And unless we find some way to link that transmission to the WSPP and other RSE contracts, we're gonna have a problem. And I think there'll be, if there's market power, which I think in some paths, there's significant concentration in the rights holdings.
Okay. Okay. Again, let me just understand this part though. So, because it's your concern at a high level is that you feel like you need to buy these transmission rights bilaterally, and you're worried that instead they'll be held out to sell in the EDAM.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like the reverse of generally we've been talking about ISOs for 20 years, and we generally want more capacity in the ISOs.
Exactly.
And so what's preventing a match between, so if there's too much capacity in the actual market, what's preventing that from finding its way to these contractual arrangements? So for example, if you just self-scheduled your import contract into IFM, wouldn't then implicitly you're basically using the IFM's transmission capacity and paying the resulting congestion revenues associated with it? But
if it's but if it's relying on transmission that's in an EDAM area to get to the border, the only party who can self-schedule on it is the party who might have market power, right? So, right.
Okay, so yeah, I we'd have to work through exactly what. So it's a combination of market power that they control the generation that is the export as well as the transmission, or they just can kind of control the amount of transmission, period.
I think it's the transmission itself. And I I want to be clear here. They'll be able to do this without doing anything nefarious. They could just say, geez, I'm releasing my transmission to the market to be optimized by the market. But if other entities can't get credit for the capacity resource that they have that's relying on that transmission to get to the boundary, then we have a problem.
I mean, if it's not used in EDAM, if it's released to EDAM but isn't used, then it's available afterwards to be purchased, right? So
Right,
if
but I expect it'll be used in
Okay.
EDAM. And so it was used, available, but then there needs to be a way to make that available to the people who needed it to meet the RSE. I think it's as part of the tagging requirements, for example.
So are you talking about a situation, Doug, where you clear your transaction in the IFM and you actually use that transmission, but you haven't paid for it, but so you've used it and it's no longer available to be sold afterwards, but then you can't buy it to meet the tagging requirement? Is that it?
That's exactly it. See, today people don't, they can, the generators and the people selling WSPP contracts have some level of confidence that the transmission is going to get released and they'll be able to get it to meet their obligations. But with the EDAM mechanism, I think a lot less of that transmission is going to get released to EDAM, not to which we want, not to the bilateral markets. And because you won't have this hammer because remember now, when it gets released, the rights holder gets nothing, right? The transmission provider gets to sell it a second time.
Right, but you're talking, Doug, you said nothing's gonna be left over. Let's stay on that case of where it all gets used up in EDAM, in which case there's nothing left for the transmission owner to sell because it's all scheduled. So, I mean, that's the case where I think we're talking about. And so it's not going to get released because it's all used, but it seems like there is
Right.
a little balance here that it gets scheduled, and your transaction is the one that's using it to be scheduled, but then you have to afterwards show that you have it, but you can't because it was scheduled in EDAM.
Yeah, so presumably it's going to get tagged from the source BAA to CAISO, but it's not going to get tagged by the party who needed it to support their RSE.
Well, I'm saying suppose it is your transaction, it clears. You offer it in the IFM and it clears. So you're actually using it, but you don't have, how does the tagging work? If this transaction gets cleared in suppose, his transaction is offered in the IFM, it clears.
Yeah.
How
So
does he then, it does get.
Don't you get to tag it then?
Well, this is the weird part, right? Because there's not an import taking place. There's this proposal that like if a generator in an EDAM area sells, gets dispatched above their transmission rights, then they'll get charged under the OAT for the use of that transmission. But it isn't necessarily transmission to a particular intertie, right? It's just accessing the EDAM. So that, you can't.
So what happens? Let me, and maybe I need Danny and Milos to help me here. But suppose I submit a Schedule C contract at the border and it clears because I have to, right? If I use it to pass RSC, I have to self-schedule it. So it's going to clear into the ISO. Then am I supposed to tag it or what happens? I mean, if I use the transmission.
Yeah, I mean, if it clears the IFM, it seems like that's a pretty good kind of tagging equivalent.
No, but
there's the internal congestion issue.
But under EDAM, you won't, unless you're the rights holder or, you've acquired rights to the border, you're not going to be scheduling at the border, right? You'll be bidding your resource at the resource.
Well, no, but I mean, if somebody else uses it instead of you, that's your problem. That you needed to bid lower to clear in the market. But I think the issue I'm concerned about with is if you're actually the one who clears, is there a catch-22 that because you used up the capacity, that it can't be offered for sale. And because it can't be offered for sale, you can't buy the transmission and you can't tag the transaction, even though it cleared in IFM.
Yeah, in other words, we're talking about a scenario where, let's just say there's a generator internal to some area and you have a bilateral contract with it and it's self-scheduled. It's used to show the RSE. It's scheduled into IFM and it clears. Like the question then is, what are the tagging requirements and the tagging privileges associated with that purchase out of IFM from an external area into CAISO? Because that seems to be the case you're worried about.
No, but what I'm worried about is even before you get to that stage, that party who previously could have relied on this transmission getting released in the very short term won't be able to rely on that anymore. And he won't have the hammer, the threat of the loss of the value of the transmission. That'll be gone. And so
I don't agree with that, Doug. I don't agree with that, because if it's not all used in EDAM, it's there to be purchased. So I mean, the scenario is it's all used in EDAM.
Yeah, you seem to be worried about somebody else getting the transmission.
The market will get the transmission. Everybody will get it.
Well, that's somebody, though. That's somebody being scheduled. Not unless it's you being scheduled, it's somebody else.
Yeah, and then I don't think the RSC fails either, because the power is still flowing. And it might not be your power that you showed.
No, but
I'm not sure what happens with the RSC implications in that point.
No, I think the RSE, though, if you don't tag it by the stuck time horizon, right? If you don't tag it within 3 hours or cure by the stuck, then that turns into a failure of the RSE, that amount of capacity.
So is what you're saying, Doug, that a challenge in decomposing an EDM transfer that used that transmission into an individual tag showing a resource can get from generator to sink?
Yes.
It just seems like if it clears IFM, either we don't need a tag, or the tag should just be sort of issued to, some resource that clears IFM.
They want to get paid for the transmission. The transmission owners want to get paid for the transmission by somebody.
But they're going to get paid for it.
They're getting the congestion
keep hole.
Okay.
No. They're going to get paid for it because they either sold it to a rights holder who's paying for it, or it's this keep hole, for the unsold transmission. They'll be paid.
Yeah, this is Milos. Let me see if I can help here as well. But I think as a general point, I think the ISO would have a concern with allowing a resource to count for the resource efficiency evaluation with absolutely no obligation to buy transmission. Let's put aside whether it's WSPP Schedule C or a regular arrangement. I think a general concern of a generator I'm going to count for the RSC, but at the same time, I haven't made any transmission arrangements to get to the counterparty in another EDAM BA. That's why we've kind of introduced the bucket one concept. And when we talk about later in the transmission section, that if you can account for the resource efficiency evaluation, you have to demonstrate you have the transmission to be able to deliver that and honor that contract for whoever you're counting for the resource efficiency evaluation. The one nuance is these WSPP Schedule C arrangements, where we've said, because these are delivered firm energy contracts where the buyer takes title to the power at the interface with that EDAM balancing area, we've said the rules may be a little bit different here because the West has relied significantly on these. Historically, these are reliable. And so in those instances, it's okay. You don't know the source, you don't know the transmission ahead of the day-ahead market run, but we're going to require later that you then provide that confidence that this supply is actually going to show up if it clears the market by you submitting a tag and demonstrating that you've made the necessary arrangements, both from a sink side, source side, as well as the transmission side. So I think a general requirement where I think what you're suggesting, Doug, maybe just putting aside the distinction between WSPP Schedule C and other arrangements, where if somebody else has made the transmission available, just use that to meet somebody else's RSC obligation that doesn't have the transmission. I think it's problematic. I think it's a little bit separate from it's a completely different design than the buckets and needing to have transmission to meet the resource sufficiency evaluation. I think in the WSPP Schedule C context, that's where I think there may be a little bit of a nuance where we've said that, okay, today they may be supported by non-firm transmission in some instances, and that would remain as well because that's a delivered product. You're not necessarily controlling how it's delivered to you at the interface. But this general concept of just, I may be a resource showing for the RSC and I don't have transmission, so let me count somebody else's transmission that just voluntarily made it available to the EDAM. I think that would be problematic. So maybe there's a way to narrow down on your concerns.
But then, Milos, you would need some other mechanism to assess whether there's market power in the transmission market and mitigate it. And because the only mitigation mechanism now is this automatic release of the transmission that wasn't scheduled, and that's going to go away with EDAM.
Well, not really, right? So,
I should say it'll effectively go away because parties who never got compensated for the unused transmission will have a way to be compensated, which is good. I mean, great, compensate.
Yeah. But wait, but it still means that someone scheduled that transmission in the IFM, or there's none left.
No, the IFM scheduled it, right?
Right. But if someone else used it, I don't see there's a problem because it all got used. So the only case that worries me is the case where you used it and you have no way to buy. We need to provide you a way to buy the tag.
Right.
You've already been scheduled for it, where effectively your schedule used the transmission, so it's no longer available to be bought after the EDAM. But maybe we have just a provision that if you clear in the IFM, you can always pay a transmission charge to meet the requirement.
Which is one of the proposed solutions that we made.
Right.
Although I thought I heard Milos basically saying that's not sort of the goal of the RSC, that they actually do want to require some kind of bilateral transmission be acquired before, for meeting the RSC. And so you're kind of creating this new requirement for transmission, and if I'm understanding Doug, his concern is that transmission owners will be less willing to sell it now because they will have a more appealing alternative, and more appealing than today. Now, it seems like if we're putting a higher value on bilaterally acquired transmission in advance of the RSC, that probably should clear at a higher price than the expected congestion price because there's some additional requirement. Whether that's appropriate or not, I think is another question. But I think that's what so what we were just discussing, Scott, is that, okay, well, if you buy it out of IFM, given the other ways we've allowed these contracts to participate, that doesn't seem too inconsistent, because it does turn out that the generation was feasible and did actually exist, and the transmission was feasible too. So there isn't really a problem in that sense, except that I don't know, the spirit of this, you should line it up before the IFM or else it doesn't really count for the IFM.
I don't think you have to line it up before the IFM, just you have to pay for it. And that's why I'm saying you could say you can pay for it. Have a rule that you not only get aside from the congestion rights, you have to pay for something for the firm transmission. If you clear in EDAM and no transmissions available because it cleared in bucket 1 and 2, and you used it.
And so you should have to pay an additional amount for the tag?
Yeah, the whole thought behind the WSPP accommodation is not to require firm tagged schedules prior to running the market, right? Like, we recognize that these are non-resource specific and potentially scheduled on different transmission paths in that time frame.
But my concern is still that suppose all of the transmission is used by you. You buy you use it, you then can't buy it. That seems like a catch-22.
Well, and I think that the problem is the WSPP suppliers who used to rely on this released transmission, they won't be able to rely on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think
it'll
this
just get used by the market.
I think it may help once we get to actually the transmission discussion, because I think, again,
Yeah.
Doug, on the bucket, on the pathway two, it's a fairly narrow pathway as to what transmission can be released to the market ahead of time. It doesn't include NITs. So any NITs, to the extent that's prevalent across the transmission providers, BA, that's not part of pathway two. So that can make plenty of, if unused, non-firm ATC available, as well as shorter-term firm products like weekly, daily, hourly firm that's not scheduled, that becomes available as non-firm. So it maybe helps, once we get to the transmission and narrowing in on the buckets and what can be made available to the market, that maybe helps to answer some of this as well, and seeing how big of a problem is it, and to what extent is it going to reduce some of those, right, or non-firm ATC availability. But
yeah, we do have some other important topics still to cover on the RSE.
Appreciate you.
So yeah, maybe, we can come back to this when we talk about transmission as well. But I feel like I heard a slightly different perspectives from Milos and Danny on this, like the spirit of what kind of transmission should be required to pass the RSE. Although maybe you both just acknowledged that the spirit is it should be firm, but then we've got this WSPPC thing going on over here, and that's just different.
I think the best classification would be highly reliable. Whether it's firm or it's non-firm that gets regularly released, I think there's not a prescription on what the designation has to be. We would just expect it to be able to be tagged come 3 hours after the market results or by the stuck horizon.
Yeah, and it does seem like if everything's feasible and it clears the IFM, that there should be a pathway to that counting. And it does raise this other interesting question: if the RSE is just about making sure that there's a feasible way to serve load, and there's an expensive source that gets crowded out by a cheaper source flowing from the same place to the same destination, reliability is not a problem at that point. And yet I guess the RSE would fail because the wrong source gets tagged. That's another thing to contemplate from this. That's where the the Doug source gets crowded out by some cheaper source, where, when you think about it, that's not really a problem because we've still got the same amount of power coming into the BA that needs it.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good, if Doug's more expensive source gets crowded out by a cheaper source, then everybody kind of wins, right? That's what we're trying to do with running the market.
Right, but then I guess that might count as an RSE failure in the end because of the tagging rules.
Yeah.
But I guess the issue is, suppose it can't be delivered, and we counted on that. So we basically were counting on more capacity than could be scheduled in on that intertie in order to pass our reliability requirements. And therefore, in real time, yes, it gets crowded out on the intertie, but we don't have the power. So
yeah, I think that's a separate case where we should be able to check whether it's just not feasible. there just isn't enough power coming in from anywhere, versus like it's coming in, but it's just coming in from a different source.
Right.
We should have the power to be able to differentiate between those two cases.
I guess if in the RSE you show which intertie it's coming in on, then we can avoid overscheduling it. But if it's like a WSCC where you don't tell us where it's coming from in the RSE, then we can't avoid overscheduling.
Well, should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, just a quick question. Given that we're over time now, I don't know if Danny, you want to prioritize things as something that you think is we should definitely address out of the remaining slides, or can it all go fairly quickly so we can get on to transmission, which of course is directly related to what we're talking about now, but
But we do have we may have some extra time in the afternoon because of the shorter GHG discussion. So maybe we should cover at least what you think is important, Danny.
Yeah, we could either wrap transmission around lunch or see how that goes.
Yeah, I think that there's not a ton left on the RSC. We've kind of talked around a few of the additional slides already, or hit on them. So,
I mean, the export constraint and the penalties I kind of wanted to talk about. And
yep, those are the two that we can focus on them.
Great. Well, why don't we see how it goes the next 20 minutes, and we could wrap transmission around lunch, start it, and then take a break and then come back. So let's go ahead to the next slide then.
Okay. So this is talking about kind of the failure consequences and the surcharge. The idea here is we're trying to set this up so that failing the RSE by a reasonable amount would be similar to just going and procuring that block of energy in the day-ahead bilateral market. This design was in response to stakeholder desire to kind of set up this paradigm. We considered an in-market solution rather than this after-the-fact surcharge that is based upon the failure amounts. It gets really complicated to try to figure out what the right price is for an in-market solution for a single hour when you're trying to compare it to a 16-hour block. And it probably doesn't work with our existing price caps, which I don't think are proposed to be redesigned at the time that, I can't guarantee will be in place through the price formation initiative at the time EDAM goes live. So we have this after the fact surcharge based off an RSE failure amount with this goal of trying to have it be similar to a day-ahead bilateral block of energy. There are bands that we'll go over that have less significant failures where there's really no consequence because given that we're procuring on fairly high levels of uncertainty, stakeholders didn't see a lot of risk in really small failures, but then there are more stiff surcharges if a BAA is really insufficient coming into the day-ahead market. The other thing that we have is we've tried to have a repeated prospective adder that gets applied for BAAs that have failures that we think would impact market clearing results or those larger failures that could potentially even impact reliability on tight days. This would be to add 1% for every day, basically, that they've had a failure over a rolling window. So kind of repeated failures are reviewed and have ratcheting up consequences. All of the numbers that we're kind of pitching out are something that we stakeholdered and there seems to be alignment on, but we would look to, once we implement review, and see if they're having the desired effect and if the consequences are right sized. So can we go to the next slide, because this has what the failure levels would be. So again, these are the three tiers. The first tier is a pretty small failure. Second tier is a failure that a BA wasn't able to meet their load in at least 50% of their IRU requirement. And then the third tier would be they can't meet their load or 50% of their IRU requirement.
Okay.
That's a typo, right? Yeah.
Which one?
Tier 3, that should be more than 50%. Is that right?
Yeah, it depends how you want to view it. They can't meet 50% of their IRU requirement as well as their demand.
Yeah, it's just the tier 2 and tier 3 conditions are identical.
Yeah, it should be more. Yeah, yep, it should be more. You're right.
And okay, when surcharge in addition to what? I guess
it's based off. So the market is going to clear the insufficiencies if it can. Yeah. And then, so the market prices will result, and then the surcharge will be calculated after the fact based off RSE failure amounts.
And are you asking, Jim, what the multipliers be multiplied by?
Well, yeah, I think that's one part of it is, what we'll multiply it by, but I think that's coming next. That's going to be one of these bilateral contracts, right? And then the other is just sort of a surcharge implies that there's a charge and then there's an additional charge. And I was trying to understand what the charge was before we got to the surcharge. And I guess you're saying it's just the market price, or because
Yeah, it's the it would be the
excuse me.
it would be the hub prices at PV or mid-C.
Well, no, that's the thing we're multiplying by, isn't it?
It's the failure amount. So across the 24 hours, maybe the maximum failure amount was for 10 megawatts. So it'd be 10 megawatts times that price with the credit applied, then times these multipliers.
Okay. So yeah, in other words, 1 is the charge and 0.25 is the surcharge or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, the entire thing could be viewed as a surcharge because it's on top of whatever the day of market results cleared at, right?
Right. I think of this as a penalty because they're just buying whatever out of the market, just like everybody else, and then in addition they have to pay this.
Yes.
Okay. And as with all ex post additional surcharges, it could be that it'll be more than what the VAAs would have been willing to pay for that power had they faced the full price of it within the IFM, right?
I don't think so, Ben. I don't think the penalty is based on the IFM solution. It's based on the RC failure. So that this is different from what we're talking about in the WEAM. I think this is
quantities. Yeah.
This is quantity of failure, nothing to do with the IFM solution. So
Okay. So it shouldn't affect the IFM solution. Got you.
Yeah, it shouldn't. And then the other thought here, Ben, is we don't want it to affect the IFM solution. Like that, the whole idea is you should have been resource efficient prior to coming in, and this is roughly equivalent to what you would have had to, like that tier 2 failure should be within the ballpark of what you would have had to do to procure a on-peak block of energy anyway.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, the rolling period that you would be adding the additional 1% over, accumulating that, how long of a rolling period are you thinking of?
I think a month, like 30 days.
Okay, so you could add as much as 30% then.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, it's a percent of what? So are we talking about the quantity of the failure or on the surcharge percentage?
So the quantity of the failure, you fail by 10 megawatts, that gets multiplied by the on-peak price at PV or mid-C.
Yeah.
And then that gets multiplied by this surcharge.
Right, but then we're going back to the repeat offender sort of thing.
Okay.
What?
Yeah,
so that 1%, where does that factor in?
It would be 1.26 or 1.27 or 2.01 or 2.02.
Got it. Okay.
And that's just to have some recognition of repeated failures are not desirable.
On the price and not the quantity. Okay, I think that's clear.
Yeah, and then is the next slide get into the bilateral contract?
I don't think so. I think the next slide moves on to we tried to kind of keep this at a higher level and just have talking points. But
I see.
If you want to talk about the bilateral,
I guess
by all means.
I haven't fully baked. There's just some interesting kind of incentives here about, we're linking now trades in this bilateral market to the penalties here, and I guess a lot of WSPC contracts may also be priced at similar benchmarks, I would assume. And so it just seemed, I'm just trying to process the implications of kind of tying those things mechanically together. Because if you could buy a WSPPC contract at this index, why would you ever pay this penalty?
Well, I think that's the idea is you should.
Yeah.
If you if you can buy it pre-day ahead, then you should, and then everybody's resource sufficient, and we don't have to get into this surcharge.
Yeah, I guess there's sort of a yeah, minimum competency test going on here. And again, it's sort of what are we accomplishing? And remind me again about I read this, but I've forgotten. We've got a certain block that we are matching this to, correct? It's a 16 hour block.
Yep,
And,
that would be the 16-hour on peak for upward failures.
Right.
On peak times.
And so that's one price for 16 hours. But if my failure occurs in, say, hour 20, then am I just paying for that 1 hour of failure?
No, it's across the entire on-peak block, but there's a credit that's then offered for hours you don't fail, where you get to basically recoup what the market value of that energy would have been. That offsets the surcharge. One of the things that some stakeholders pointed out kind of in our process was that if you buy a 16-hour block of power, like during the hours you're not as sufficient, like you can either remarket that power, you can not use your resources, like that. There is a residual value for that in your quote unquote past hours. So we tried to recognize that.
Right. I guess I'm trying to think of like the 2020 hour where there was a 30, I don't know, there was a expensive 16-hour block contract, but that kind of implies that the price, if we hadn't capped it in CAISO, should have been $4,000 or $5,000 in a couple hours and much lower in other hours. And so mechanically though, if I fail just 1 hour, then what exactly is the quantity that my surcharge is applied to?
It's that 1 hour of failure. It basically, if you fail on peak, then it'll be applied to the 16 hours of on-peak time. But you'll get a credit for all of the past hours at whatever the value of the energy would be in the market during those past hours.
Okay, so I'm paying 1.25 times the bilateral contract in penalty, but I'm getting back the IFM price, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm basically paying a 25, and assuming everything's perfectly arbitraged and that the IFM, which with price caps mean this could be different, by the way. But yeah, mechanically what would happen is I pay, if I fail by 1 megawatt in hour 20, then I pay 1.25 times a 1 megawatt hour, 16-hour block in surcharge or in penalty, but then minus one megawatt times the IFM price in all of the other 15 hours that I actually passed.
Yeah, I think that you would not have the surcharge applied in those hours in the past hours too. Like you'd apply the surcharge in the failed hour. Like it's essentially an hourly calculation for the on-peak block. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Jim.
Okay, so but yeah, I would divide by 16 by my math. It sounds like maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other thing I noticed for off-peak or downward failures, it is an hour. It's right now proposed as just an hourly penalty, and that's due to there not being as much concern within the stakeholder community about downward failures or non-peak failures.
Yeah, and I think some stakeholders have pointed out that, there have been concerns with liquidity in these markets. And I do wonder, again, sort of once we start mechanically linking this to failures, and even like it seems like the difference between this contract and IFM prices would be part of the failure calculation. I do wonder sort of what the implications of that would be. You might get better arbitrage, or you might get, if it's a really liquid market, you might get more incentives for mischief in the bilateral market. But still kind of trying to process that. But I do know it's been, thinking back to that August 2020 trade that was at the super high price in, I think it was Four Corners. I think it's been pointed out that there weren't a lot of megawatts traded at that price. But not sure, again, what the implications there are.
Yeah, that's another concern that was raised in the stakeholder process, which is using the hubs. And I think that it's something we recognize right now. I think to the extent they become more and more illiquid if EDM grows, then I think we would look to revisit it. But right now, it made more sense to try to benchmark it off those hubs than anything else we could think of. I know the market results were even pitched, but then that starts basing the market surcharge on the market results, which seemed not ideal to us.
Who knows? Maybe this even boosts the liquidity because people will want to use this to comply.
I think it's better than just having a really high penalty price, because at least on the days where it's not tight, the penalty will be lower.
Right,
So
which we've been asking for a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It does scale to prevailing prices.
Yep.
And then it also the different kind of design for off-peak and downward failures is also respective of the fact that those system conditions probably don't warrant as serious of a surcharge.
And I guess if you're in a super constrained area, you maybe could take advantage of the fact that the hub is cheaper than your actual energy. But it is a surcharge on top of the energy purchase anyway, so. Okay.
The one other thing I want to kind of add is that to the extent that the credit with the surcharge could make this a money-making venture, we wouldn't allow that. There's no failing is not going to give you a positive credit in any hours. It'll be capped at 0 penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We would expect a lot of noise in terms of the difference between the IFM price and the average over 16 hours of mid-C or whatever. So you might have a positive credit almost half the time.
And I forget if there was a failure at say 5 in the morning, and it's an up failure, we still use this peak price, or was there?
I think the idea is to use and just a multiplier times the market clearing price. It's a little bit different because it's like it's the weighted average of the LMPs within the deficient BAA that you calculate the multiplier on, but it would be based off a market price.
Okay.
The one point to tie back to our other discussion is it does make a difference here about how you allocate the penalties. I mean, the RSC violations over the day if they've got storage resources, because the cost is going to be higher here depending on a big failure in 1 hour versus small.
But our proposed cost minimization, which should minimize the failure quantity across the day, I would think would not just isolate. It's not going to min the number of hours with really big failures. It's going to spread it out to smaller failures during more hours. Which
I don't think so, Danny. I don't think so. I think if the penalty price is the same in all the hours, and if there's no nonlinear impact in the objective function, the larger failures, it's going to be indeterminate, and the vendor is going to do something. So you want to make sure you know what the vendor's doing, because it will matter.
Okay, so then your point is when we get into the BRS, actually specify when we have to decide which of the optimal solutions that the market will produce. Okay, that's
you could use different penalty prices for different hours of the day, or lots of things. But you'll have to do something to get to implement what you have in mind.
Yeah, it seems like working a 10 megawatt into that. I don't know how complicated that would be, but so, you would basically, first choice would be to spread your shortfall, less than 10 megawatts or less over as many hours as you can. And then after that, you're still into some tiebreaker rules as well.
Yeah, but this penalty function, the way it works, we might think that the best time is to have a failure in the early morning hours where nothing's going on, but But under this penalty rule, you'd still have to buy the power for the whole day and then
Mhm.
sell it at the IFM, buy it back at the IFM or sell at the IFM, so you could still get a large loss.
That's
So
true. Yeah.
it's a tricky, a little bit tricky here.
I mean, would we expect, like, I'm just thinking back to the RSC though, and like, I'd expect most of the failures to be kind of across peak, not in the morning.
Right, but I mean, you were saying when storage matters. If it's just resources, but if you've got a lot of storage, then how you move the storage around might be able to create, shortfalls at different times. It might not matter because it'll always be on peak, but I'm just
It's
making a
something
point.
that, yeah, I think your point is well taken, Scott. Like, to the extent that we need tiebreakers, we will keep this design in mind when we set those tiebreakers with the vendor.
That's all it is. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, export constraints.
I think there's one more slide in between and then export constraint. Can we go to the next slide, Michelle? This is then talking about trying to link the EIM
right.
and the EDAM RSC. We are trying to cure through the EDAM. It's a tiered, that EDAM deficiency surcharge will be at the discretion of each BAA. It'll be pro rata allocated out to BAAs who have passed. For the CAISO, we would look for a two-tiered allocation. So we would look to make sure that all of the basically RA obligations were met, and then if not, it would mean that the entire program is short. I want to note that the assistance energy transfers that we put out in the EIM RSC would be something that would be available to cure insufficiencies in the real-time market for the WEIM pooled approach. But it seems like, unless you guys have questions, we can kind of move on in the name of time.
There was one question that DMM and some other people brought up about, can virtual supply in one balancing area, cause the IFM to clear, and then everything is okay, it's cured in the IFM, but it's not really cured. I mean, it seems to me the test shouldn't be whether it's cured in the IFM, but whether it's cured in RUC.
When you're getting to, is that to any of these bullets or just more in general, how will virtual supply?
The top bullet, to cure deficiencies through the EIM, through the EDAM, which I think of as, you're short of capacity in the RSC, but you're able to clear all your load in the EDAM, so it's okay. And there's a lot of complicated rules that I don't totally understand about load shedding thereafter, but suppose you clear in the EDAM because of virtual supply or underbidding or, whatever.
Yeah, I understand your point. Yeah, a more accurate way we'll try to clear through the day-ahead market process, which would be IFM, but ultimately would be RUC when we replace the virtual supply. So yeah, that's a good correction, Scott.
Thanks.
No, thank you. That's helpful to point that out for our framing of this. Michelle, can we go to the next slide? So this is talking about the pooled EIM RSC. I think this is a concept we've already talked a lot of these elements on. Unless there's questions, we can move on to the export constraint.
Yeah, I think the discussion earlier today did kind of raise the question of whether pooling is still the right thing to do, I think.
So, yeah, at least where I've landed with that is that part of the value proposition of EDAM is the day-ahead diversity benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't pool in the EIM, effectively every BAA just procured less imbalance reserves. So, which kind of gets rid of the diverse, like you don't get the same level of imbalance reserve collective procurement if you have an individualized test.
I think maybe there's two ways of thinking about this. You're thinking about pooling and therefore we pass on a pooled basis.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other side of it is consequences when we fail on a pooled basis. And those need to be BA by BA perhaps. And we
And I
talked
think
a little bit about that before. And I think that's maybe as I think about it, what I've heard, maybe that's really the issue is when we fail, there need to be BA by BA consequences and they need to fall in the right BA.
And it's not absolute, but I think that to a large extent they do, because if the pool fails and they're not able to cure and the assistance energy transfers aren't able to cure, ultimately the real-time market would try to do everything it can, but then it will relax the PVC in the BAA who's short, and then the manual operator actions take place after that. That's at least a signifier of what the problem they're trying to solve is. But to your point you made earlier, it's not so, like, they do still have obligations for EM transfers that would be pro rata curtailed with their own load. So there is a bit of a shared element of WEIM consequences.
And do we count, suppose I was scheduled with IFM imports and things are really tight. Do those IFM imports count to reduce my need for load shedding in real time?
So in the real-time market in the WEIM RSC, any intertie bids will count towards the supply stack for the entire pool.
Whether they cleared IFM or not?
Well, the ones that would clear IFM do come in as schedules into the real time, but then on top of the ones that clear IFM, the real time only ones also serve as an additional surplus of supply.
So that's one of the benefits. Because today you wouldn't be allowed to count those things, right?
In the WEIM RSC?
Yeah.
I think other than CAISO, other BAs don't. The ISO does use cleared economy energy HASP transactions in its supply stack.
I was thinking of an example. Suppose I have 1,800 megawatts of load in real time and I cleared 1,850 in the IFM, but I only have 1,600 megawatts of resources because, I cleared imports in the IFM. Would the load shedding be based on the fact that I've got 1,800 megawatts of load and 1,600 megawatts of resources, or that I have 1,800 megawatts of load and that's what I cleared in the IFM?
I think this question's a little bit more nuanced. If you cleared a bunch of imports, we'd expect them to be tagged, and then if they're not tagged, that BA would be kicked out of the pool, so they're on their own in the WEIM anyway.
No, but I'm not talking about tagged imports. I'm talking about an EDAM. So EDAM runs an optimization, and suppose some of my resources were expensive, so they didn't clear. So I cleared 1,800 megawatts of load in the EDAM, but I only cleared 1,600 megawatts of my own generation. And implicitly, I'm relying on EDAM transfers.
For the other 200?
For the other 200. Then when we look at the real-time rule, is it my real-time load? Suppose my real-time load's 1825. That says I'm 25 megawatts short compared to my EDAM, or am I, 225 megawatts short relative to my real-time supply?
You're 25 megawatts short. The EDAM schedules would come into the WEIM, it's fixed.
Okay.
We were talking just a moment ago about benefits of pooling and Scott's proposal that if it's reliable, pool, and if you fail, then do a BA by BA consequence. Do you think that deals with effectively with Kathleen's concern, where and of course she should speak for herself,
yeah.
but
I think she was worried about the opposite situation where there's passing.
yeah, so it does sound like that. Okay. Well, it would pass once you count the diversity. If you pass, including the diversity benefit, then that's fine. The system is reliable. And under Scott's proposal, it's only if with pooling it doesn't work, and then you have to do some sort of blame apportionment.
That's not Scott's proposal. Danny says that's actually the design. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it can be both.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah. Let's go on.
Okay. Then I think the last slide is, I think, what some of us have been waiting to, or has been alluded to. Can we go to the next slide, Michelle? This is the net export constraint. And so the idea here is going back to that really simple example. A BA has 10 megawatts of supply and 8 megawatts of load. They make all 10 available. They say, I only want 1 megawatt of my excess to be exported out. I want to retain 1 megawatt for, maybe I have fires in my area. Maybe I have replacement reserves that I want to carry. Maybe I'm new to EDAM and I just want to make sure and get to know and trust this market. And I want to use this as kind of a almost EDAM training wheels. Then they simply set the export constraint, and it would control what amount of capacity above what they need to meet their load can be exported from their balancing authority area.
And okay, I'm trying to understand how what the equivalents are today. And so this would, for example, IFM exports, will they become more firm once all of this is adopted than an IFM export out of CAISO today?
So the way I view this is essentially an EDAM transfer would be like a PT export is today. They're no longer going to be the
right. So there's no need to show.
Yeah,
there's no need to show a local non-RA resource kind of thing.
Yeah, and so what this is trying to do, though, is address the fact that some BAAs, such as the ISO, have different must-offer obligations than other BAAs with regards to what their contracted supply is. So it gives all BAs a little bit of an ability to control how much of their forward contracted supply is made available for firm EDAM-type transfers to other BAAs.
Seems to me this is the twin of the issue we just discussed, because here the issue is with our IFM settlement. Suppose I'm the BAA that has 1,600 megawatts of load, cleared 1,800 megawatts of exports and another 100 megawatts of imbalance reserves, and then I lose 200 megawatts in real time. So I've only got 1,700 to cover my 1,900 megawatts of schedules. I guess I'd be the one who had to shed load, right?
I think the EDAM transfers would have a pro rata curtailment with your 1,600 megawatts of supply. So it'd be 1/9 basically would be curtailed off the transfers if that's what the system operators needed to do.
Right.
But I guess the idea here is it lets that BA decide, are they comfortable having 200 megawatts of EDAM exports that they're on the hook for?
Right, I know. I think this is the twin. This is, that's rule, the rule we talked about to protect the people who are importers, conversely creates some downside for exporters. So they may want to have some margin.
And yeah, I don't fully have the intuition here, but if everybody set this constraint at exactly their RSE or epsilon above their RSE requirements, then does that mean there's basically no diversity benefit? Or does the RSE requirement already sort of bake in the benefits? Because
I think there would. So you're saying if you do this, does this de facto zero out any transfers and any ability to realize the diversity benefit? I think if there's no ability to transfer, and if nobody's making surplus supply able to transfer, then there should be probably no diversity benefit, would be my initial take. Because each BA is just being optimized on their own, given their own supply stack and resources.
But their target, Danny, is set based on the diversity benefit, and what they cleared, they'd still have to supply.
Oh, okay. But the diversity benefit lowers the target, doesn't it?
Right, the lowers the target for everybody, but they have to. But we need less. But we have to make available what we got. What we cleared, we had to make available. It's only what we didn't clear that we can hold back, right?
It's on top of your RSE obligation, which includes an IRU, which is inclusive of the diversity benefit. Yeah, you're right, Scott. I think I misspoke.
Any concerns with folks being able to use this to economically withhold and exercise market power? If there's BAA that would like to restrict its exports and try to goose the price up.
To us, not really, because they still have to have enough supply to meet their obligation in the first place.
But yeah, I guess if they're, so I've been trying to think about the same thing here. And I guess, what you're imagining, Ben, is a scenario where you're a large exporter and you just want to sort of control the amount of power reaching your customers. And I guess if you're that big and you're an exporter, you're not subject to market power mitigation because there isn't a local market power thing. And so I don't know if you even need this constraint to execute that kind of strategy. You could just bid it at $750 or $1,000 or whatever, even without this, although this may be a way of making it look a little less ugly, I suppose. Yeah, I did. I can't remember if this is coming up later or not, but I made some notes about how this interacts with scarcity pricing as well. So yeah, it looks like if you reach scarcity in one region, then this basically, the export constraint is set at the actual flows.
It'll control the flows.
Yeah, but it seemed to mechanically then prevent the, it creates congestion. So let's say that it seems like it's creating a congestion constraint on top of the physical congestion that would prevent scarcity from the exporting region reaching the level of the importing region when the importing region is scarce.
Right. So the exporting region would keep a lower price. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It'd be just like a transmission constraint.
And so is that desirable? Or I'm trying to understand why. Because it seems like on the one hand, it prevents the scarcity in the importing area from spilling over into prices in the exporting area.
I think it could definitely, it could prevent lower cost supply from going to meet scarcity in a different area, but the scarcity in that different area is only there in the first place because that's what that BAA offered into the real-time or the day-ahead market to meet their own obligations. And I think think it was Ben's point, I think you could do this anyway by just bidding your surplus supply really high.
And not offering, which they can do in the EIM today.
Right,
There's no
right.
must
Or
offer.
yeah, and
They just not offer. Yeah.
that's a good point, Scott. That's the other thing is right now that possibility exists for all EDM BAs that don't have a day ahead must offer obligation, which I think is probably going to be most of them.
Okay, so just again, so I understand how this is going to work. I'm an importing area, and I have a PBC, and there's flows coming in, but not congested. And if that happens, then we're going to set the export constraints from everybody sending power into the short area to the level of the actual flows, so that the exporting areas do not hit the PBC levels. Am I getting that right?
No, I think that's like the converse of how I understood it. It's on a BAA basis, so it's not on the importing. It's the exporting BAA sets how much of their net supply can export out beyond their obligation.
Okay, I'll follow up on email. This is a slightly different aspect of how, this wasn't the main thing where they're voluntarily setting it, but there was some element that I may have misread that was automatically adjusting this to the actual level of actual flows in conditions where there's some PBC relaxation happening. And that seemed to, I don't know, there's some weird price signal implications as I was understanding it, but I might have understood it wrong. So let's follow up later.
Sure.
We have 4 people in the queue, so I think this is the only agenda item we're going to do this morning.
That looks like
for
it.
transmission in the afternoon, but we've got Dan, Kathleen, Robert, and Todd. So if you could make your questions or comments to the point, and then we can take lunch when we're scheduled. Dan, you can go first.
Thanks. Hi, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. This goes back a little bit to the EDAM pool versus the EIM only pool, and I may have missed this if it was discussed earlier, but let's just take for a quick example that when EDAM goes live, or for the first year, say 50% of the entire CAISO market footprint, including EIM, of load and resources is in EDAM and 50% remains EIM only. I think this is a similar thought, whether it's 80-20, 70-30, or any other split, so don't put a value judgment on that. The question is, does the calculation of the diversity credit in the real-time market flow back into the EDAM requirement and or show up in the EIM only diversity as the entire footprint's real-time market diversity credit of all loads and resources at that point? Or will you be looking at the EIM only entities as a separate pool that has its own diversity credit by assessing their loads and resources?
So I can take a first stab at that, Dan. There would be 2 different diversity, right? There's an EDAM diversity credit for the people who are participating in the EDAM. And then when you get into the WEIM, there will be another diversity credit that is applied based off the expanded WEIM footprint.
So you are then looking at, in the real-time market, you're looking at all loads and resources, whether some of those were in EDAM or not, and you're identifying what the diversity credit is, and then allocating that out to the BAs, to all BAs, except that the EDAM BAs have already passed, so what they get allocated doesn't really matter.
No, the EDAM, they're going to get retested in the WEIM just like any other BAA. It's similar to how the CAISO BAA participates. Yeah, it's similar to how the CAISO BAA right now participates in the WEIM. They get a WEIM diversity credit. It would just be the CAISO BAA plus any other EDAM BAs.
Okay, so the entities that are in EIM only are not shouldn't be expecting that their resource efficiency requirement is going to fundamentally change or go up with the insertion of EDAM.
I wouldn't think that their requirements would be materially impacted by EDAM. It's just that EDAM participants participate with day-ahead schedules into the WAM in a pool.
Okay, and then the last question with that is, if a EDAM entity doesn't pass and they're kicked out of the EDAM EIM pool, they're still getting a diversity credit in the EIM only pool at that point. It's just that they're being assessed on their own, not within the pool of the EDAM entities.
Yeah, they'd be assessed on their own.
Okay. I think that stitches it all together. Thanks for those clarifications. And I guess this is all setting aside, the changes coming in the quantile regression and all that stuff that could change some of the, hopefully improve the results overall anyway.
Yeah,
thanks.
ideally that stuff will all be in place prior to EDAM go live.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Kathleen, if you don't mind that's all the remaining 3 questions that we have in queue, if you can be to the point. Kathleen?
Hi, yeah, I'll be brief. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. This appears duplicative to us to the concepts of transmission reliability margin and capacity benefit margin that are already included in transfer capability calculations to address some of the issues that Danny described. They're already transmission offsets that are afforded under the OAT, and the CAISO is considering proposing similar treatment for itself. So across the EDAM, every area has a process to identify its PRM or CBM that it wants to include for concerns. An additional net export constraint seems duplicative, and I just think the CAISO should think harder about the interaction of these things. I also share the price formation concerns. I do think that this is a way of formalizing physical withholding in the market, and that can lead to pretty serious price formation issues. Scarcity being triggered when it shouldn't be. There's excess supply available. It also seems counter to what EDAM's purpose is of running a market to solve once you're sufficient. The last thing is that it also appears to be discriminatory towards third-party generators that are in the BAAs. You're taking the choice. Seems like you're allowing BAAs to decide what supply can be offered into the market and sold off the BAA, whereas a generator within that is now no longer able to make that choice. So you're taking agency away from the supply. Those are our concerns. Thanks.
Yeah, that letter point's an interesting, you can imagine a situation where depending on how the decision is made, the BAA could sort of strand the generation within its own control area. I think on the first couple points, I didn't see it as duplicative with the transmission, because this is all about generation, not transmission. So, I mean, it may or may not be a good idea, but I don't really think of it as duplicative of the identifying of the transmission capacity itself.
Well, the reason it's likely duplicative is that Danny gave a series of examples of why someone might want to use this. Concerns with modeling of the transmission capability. Well, that is treated with transmission reliability margin. Studies are performed to see if there's concern with accuracy of the transfer capability, and those could be updated to include EDAM impacts. So I would expect it to be handled at the transmission service provider side. And for capacity benefit margin, it's a certain amount of transmission that would be held back for emergency purchases, right? Or reserve sharing groups, which I think Danny also mentioned wanting to hold megawatts of capability back. It's the flip side of the same coin. I agree you could look at it from a generation perspective, but I think we haven't had this discussion in the stakeholder process because we haven't delved into how these mechanisms on the transmission side plus this might work in consort or counter to each other. So I'm not making a definitive statement on those, Jim. I'm more saying that, gee, this is a big one we should be working through.
I mean, but generation is completely different from transmission. I mean, the transmission constraints could not bind, but we could have exported every megawatt of generation we got. I mean, I just don't see any redundancy at all. But anyway, we can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. If we can go to Robert Fisher.
Hi, this is Robert Fisher with Energy Energy. I just wanted to hear the MSC's opinion in regards to the export constraint limiting possible sales to a BA, specifically thinking of CAISO and energy above the RA or imports that could be coming into CAISO, and just having the ability to set that export limit with no justification or ability to provide a full market outcome.
Yeah, I mean, there's a potential here to really sort of choke off, EDAM trade, because it is sort of just this parameter that limits exports. Now, I mean, when we in the after lunch, we'll talk about just transmission being made available in general, where there's some flexibility there as well, it seems like. Yeah, I think it's a question. It's definitely something to monitor. I think, if I'm understanding, so there, I understood like one of the big drivers here was concerns that today we have this LPT kind of framework that prevents our internal RA resources from being exported, and that would not be the case under this, and so this is kind of another way to try to account for that. And it would have to be a circumstance where we're worried about real time being a lot worse than IFM, even with the IRU in there, that would somehow export resources that we do end up needing in real time. So it kind of would be a really conservative thing. And then
our concern is really imports supporting those type of exports, and that export limit really constraining those available imports that are there that could support those exports while that export limit is being considered. This is a component of the market that is not taken into consideration a lot, because while there is RA, but there's also imports being put into the market that can support those exports. And if that level of export gets set where there's available imports, but you can't get any exports out, that's kind of our
okay, I see. So you're kind of worried that wheels could be choked off by this, in a sense. That
I mean, you're trying to purchase energy from it, and if there's an import that could sell it to you, then that could be something.
Well, this is Danny. I'd like to respond to that a little bit. I think to the extent any BAA wants intertie bidding, they can have intertie bidding and not have to wheel through the CAISO having intertie bidding and EDAM. Like, we're not limiting intertie bidding to the CAISO BAA. It's available to any BAA. When you look at this on the context of a wheel through, this would allow the ISO BAA to figure out of those economy energy bids, how much are they comfortable utilizing those to back firm EDAM transfers, rather than today's LPT construct where they could be curtailed if those intertie bids don't show up. So it's just trying to similarly position the ISO.
Yeah, I think it could be hourly import bids or transfers that could be trying to sell specifically in this situation. So just the concern is that exports would limit available imports that could be purchased to help support another area. But I mean, it's only limiting imports because that other area doesn't have import bidding, which is their choice, right?
Well, wait
it could be transfers though too, Danny.
Yeah.
Is this to clarify something? Is this a gross export constraint or a net export constraint?
It looks at the net.
Okay, so if it's a net export constraint, it wouldn't bind if there's another megawatt of imports coming in to support the exports. So I mean, it makes a lot of difference if it's a net or gross.
I'd like to.
I do think.
George, can you chime in? Am I describing that right?
That's right. It's a net EDAM export transfer. constraint. So it's related to EDAM transfers, not just not exports to non-EDAM BAs.
Yeah, and at that point, would it be serving load within internal to that BA or limiting possible export to another BA? That's kind of the thought process.
I think if it's net exports, it takes care of the imports and wheel throughs because they don't create a increased net export. But you had another comment, Robert, that echoes something Kathleen said about how about capacity that's not RA. And, you know, it seems like this limit should be applied to the RA, and it shouldn't apply to any export supported by non-RA, because we shouldn't be able to limit, you know, someone else's, and same thing for other BAAs. They shouldn't be, you know, they can limit what they offer. They can't limit what other entities within their BAA offer. So I think that should be the same for the CAISO. We shouldn't be able to limit the
that's kind of our
other people's RA.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, anytime you have, and flip that around, what if we have a firm or we have an import RA contract that gets bottled up because some other BA has an export constraint? You know, it does seem like this should be linked, or somehow there should be some guardrails associated with export contracts that couldn't be caught by this.
Well, I think the guardrail is ideally that RA export would be shown as a bucket one transfer, so it would be reflected in the RSC obligation.
RSC obligation already, yeah.
Both BAAs, and then that's kind of what this constraint. That's one bound of how much can you limit. It would be set on what you need to pass your RSC. Like all excess is what could be limited.
It wouldn't include imports. It wouldn't include other people's RA. It would just be RR. Every BA could just limit the amount of their RA that got exported. So that seems to address these concerns.
Yeah, which I think they do right now by just not having a day-ahead must-offer obligation, right? They only bid into the market the amount of surplus capacity of their RA that they'd be comfortable getting exported.
I guess for other balancing areas, that suppose another balancing area has a muni in it and the utility. How does this get resolved if the muni has surplus intermittence it wants to sell?
So
is it just the BAA limit or one for each LSE or what?
It's a BAA limit. We would expect, this is part of that, how the ISO will need a stakeholder process next year to figure out how it'll participate in EDAM. This is one of the things that ISO will be doing. We would expect EDAM BAAs who also have munis in them to have those same discussions about how this would be set given their internal participants.
Okay.
Thank you for the conversation.
Sure. Let's take the last question from Todd. Kathleen, I hope it's okay if we put your comment off to the afternoon since we're past the lunch hour. So Todd, you've got the honor of the last question this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. On the same topic, I'd like to make a few points on why I think the net export limit is a critical piece of the extended day-ahead market for the California entities. We don't see it as withholding. EDAM is not a full RTO. And so to the extent that other balancing areas are able to limit their participation by voluntarily offering above the RSE, this provides a mechanism for California to do a similar function in a slightly different way. It's not discriminatory to bids or generation. It doesn't limit forward contracted resources. It doesn't limit high priority wheels that have already paid for transmission service or have secured transmission through us. It doesn't prohibit other balancing areas from doing intertie bidding. If someone hasn't forward contracted, they're just a generator that's just economically bidding into CAISO, they have bid in to serve CAISO load. No other balancing area has a right to that bid until we form a full RTO. So it doesn't limit firm wheels. It doesn't, you know, this is a very fair and reasonable method of creating an equitable playing field for the TISO balancing area and standard verticals. And so I would strongly fight for this to stay into EDAM. Happy to talk further.
Okay. Thank you, Todd. Anybody want to comment on that before we break for lunch?
Yeah, just that I can see the logic there. And I think the only question is whether there's a bit too much latitude here, and whether there's some way to tie the quantities to some measure of non-RA capacity or RA capacity or something like that. I think the discussion here. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
My reading of the formulation is that it is quite restrictive. So all the firm high priority exports, all the firm wheels are already taken into account in there. Any high priority exports to non-EDAM balancing areas are already baked into our RSC. So there's only a very limited quantity that could potentially be reduced by this. And again, if the effectiveness of this would be further limited, or the options to other balancing areas would be further expanded if they took intertie bids or forward contracted to receive the high priority equivalent to our load. So there's lots of other options for participants to gain access to our supply on an equitable basis to us obtaining supply in their balancing areas.
Yeah, I would add, it sounds like this discussion, even non-firm wheels are not really constrained by this constraint, given that it's a net constraint. I think there is maybe some, yeah, if you're a non-RA resource located internal to CAISO, or any place, I guess, whether that, yeah, what that status should be. You always have a right to sell through a contract that would then be part of the RSC obligation, I guess. But yeah, that's.
But you got me thinking about how we formulate this constraint, because the net export, is there going to be a trade-off between using imports to meet CAISO load versus our own generation? This is going to have impacts on the dispatch. We can't talk through that now, but it seems like that ought to be worked through, is how this is going to actually operate when you've got a trade-off between keeping the net imports constraint or increasing generation inside.
Yeah, so generation could not be exported, but the import could be. And so that does imply a different price. I think that's relevant when the domestic generation is cheaper than the import. Yeah.
Or maybe when it's more expensive, Jim, and we could meet more, but then well, we need to think this out more.
Yeah.
I'll speculate on the fly. Got to eat lunch.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
There is food for thought here.
Let's get the blood sugar up here. We have a new operator, Silas. Thank you for joining us. We will be reconvening at 1 o'clock Pacific time, if that's okay. So I'll have 45 minutes for lunch. Danny, thank you. You held up magnificently for 3 hours plus. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions. And we'll see you to talk about transmission at 1 o'clock. And that'll be Partha, who will be presenting at that time. Okay. Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Silas, you